Tonight's story begins with chains scraping across stone, 3 slow, deliberate knocks at your door, and a whisper that somehow knows your name. You're not dreaming. You're trapped inside a medieval castle. The mattress exhales, as if someone invisible just slipped beneath the blankets beside you. Footsteps echo down the corridor. Footsteps you know you didn't make. The torchlight flickers, and with each pulse, the shadows lean closer, like they're listening. Forget the fairy tale towers you grew up with. This place isn't a magical kingdom. It's a timeshare for ghosts. And tonight, you're the unlucky guest. But before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off with us across the world. And hey, if you want to keep the ghosts from dragging me into the garderobe at midnight, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link pinned in the comments. Apparently, caffeine is the only holy water I can afford. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and together, we'll slip back into the quieter, darker corners of the past. Welcome to your medieval castle stay. No check-in desk. No complimentary breakfast. The first thing you notice isn't the towering stone walls or the faded tapestries. It's the cold. Not just the kind of chill you feel on your skin, but the kind that crawls under your clothes, burrows into your bones, and makes itself at home somewhere behind your ribs. You tell yourself it's just poor medieval design. No central heating, drafty cracks in the walls, maybe a missing window pane or two. But then the air shifts. Not randomly, but like something in the room just exhaled. That's when you realize the cold isn't creeping in from outside. It's already here, waiting for you. Forget everything Hollywood ever taught you about castles. No sweeping staircases lit by golden chandeliers. No grand banquets filled with music and laughter. No charming princes ready to dance the night away. The truth, stone that sweats. Corridors that echo with footsteps you didn't make. Windows that don't just look out over misty moors, but reflect faces that shouldn't be there. The dream of castle life is a Pinterest fantasy. The reality is more like a long-term sleepover in a crypt with slightly better views. You drop your bag onto the uneven stone floor. It hits with a thud, far too loud for its weight. The sound doesn't just echo, it vanishes, like something swallowed it whole. This isn't drywall and insulation. This is a fortress carved from fear and paranoia. Walls built to withstand battering rams and sieges, yet somehow powerless against the whispers that slither through the cracks. You try to laugh it off. It's just an old building, you tell yourself. But then, somewhere deep in the hall, a door groans shut, and no one is there. Your laugh dies in your throat. The ceilings soar so high, you feel like you've fallen into an inverted well. Staircases twist and coil like the bones of some giant creature that died mid-scream. The tapestries hanging on the walls aren't charming relics. They're heavy, faded shrouds. If one fell, it could smother you before anyone even realized you were gone. The scenes they depict, battles, hunts, endless violence, aren't quaint medieval art. They're warnings, and you're starting to wonder who or what those warnings were meant for. They're grim reminders of all the blood spilled to keep this place in the hands of one family or another. You think they're just fabric until you notice the eyes of the stitched hounds seem to follow you as you move. You tell yourself it's a trick of the candlelight. Then the candle goes out by itself. There's no concierge desk, no friendly staff with key cards, just a heavy iron key that looks like it could double as a murder weapon. Your room, they told you, is one of the oldest parts of the keep. Of course it is. The bed is enormous, carved from dark oak and draped with curtains thick enough to block out both light and logic. They bill it as authentic medieval charm. But what it really feels like is a velvet-lined coffin waiting for you to step in. You try to shake the thought, but as you sit down, the mattress exhales a puff of air as though someone else just shifted their weight beside you. You don't check. You don't want to know. Castles were built for defense, which means they're less romantic palace and more stone bunker with furniture. Everything is heavy, everything is dark, and everything is meant to last longer than you will. Even silence feels weighted here. It isn't the peaceful quiet of a countryside retreat. It's the oppressive stillness of a place that remembers too much. Every creak of the floorboards is not just sound, but accusation. Every drip from the ceiling, a reminder that the castle leaks, not just water, but history. You wonder how many people died inside these walls, starved in sieges, stabbed in betrayals, or simply rotted from plague. And then you wonder how many of them never left. Your phone loses signal the moment you step inside, which feels like a sick joke. There's no Wi-Fi, no glowing notifications to tether you to modernity. Just you and the castle, the way it's been since the 13th century. You imagine trying to explain to a medieval knight that your biggest worry was losing TikTok access, and then you realize he wouldn't hear you anyway. He'd be too busy staring through you, still marching his eternal patrol through corridors that collapsed centuries ago. You walk to the window, but the view doesn't help. The landscape rolls out in a bleak sweep of hills and black trees that look like clawed hands scratching at the sky. The moat glistens faintly in the moonlight, but instead of water, it looks like a sheet of dark glass, smooth and bottomless. You swear something moved beneath the surface. Probably a fish. Probably, when you turn back from the window, the room looks different. Even though nothing has changed, the shadows lean heavier against the corners, stretching too far from the candle flame. You could swear the air smells faintly of iron, sharp and metallic like old blood. You rub your eyes, and for a moment, you wonder if you're just letting your imagination run wild. But then you hear it, a sound like fabric brushing against stone, a slow step, another coming from the hallway, or maybe the ceiling, or maybe right behind the curtain of your bed. You sit perfectly still, holding your breath, heart thundering, like the castle itself is keeping rhythm with you. And in that moment, you understand what makes these places terrifying. It isn't just the draft, or the damp, or the architectural gloom. It's the weight of centuries pressing down, the memory of countless lives, loves, betrayals, and deaths soaked into every stone. Castles don't forget, and sometimes they don't forgive. You wanted the romance of medieval life. Instead, you got the reality. A night in a fortress where the past is still awake, restless, and watching. You wake not to the cheerful crow of a rooster or the solemn clang of a church bell, but to the sound of someone knocking on your door. At first, it seems ordinary until you remember you locked it from the inside and no one should be there. The knocking is steady, 3 deliberate raps, then silence. You hold your breath, waiting for it to come again, but instead the quiet fills with something worse, a slow dragging sound, like heavy chains pulled across stone. You tell yourself it's a servant, or maybe just the castle settling, but the chains keep moving closer, scraping against the flagstones until they stop right outside your chamber. Then a whisper, low and indistinct, curls through the darkness, slipping beneath the bed curtains and straight into your ear. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just a bad dream. It was life. For every rooster announcing dawn, there were just as many tales of spirits doing the same. The supernatural was not confined to ghost stories told by the fire. It was woven into daily rhythms, as ordinary to people then as traffic noise is to us now. Castles especially were believed to be magnets for restless souls, the thick walls holding not only the living, but the echoes of all who had died inside. Knights, servants, queens, prisoners, everyone left an imprint. So if you woke to chains rattling in the hall, it wasn't just poor insulation or rodents. It was the unquiet dead, reminding you that morning had arrived, whether you liked it or not. People spoke of the death knock, an omen that came before disaster. 3 taps on a wall or door, heard by the whole household, but with no visible hand to make them. Some families swore these knocks always came before someone fell ill or before an enemy army appeared at the gates. And when the sound traveled down corridors with no one there to create it, even the most hardened soldiers went pale. Imagine trying to prepare for your day, eating, dressing, praying, while wondering if the echo of wood against stone was a ghost, warning you or simply mocking your fragile sense of safety. Then there were the whispers. No birdsong, no neighbor's greeting, just words breathed into your ear by someone who wasn't there. Monks in drafty abs claimed to hear entire prayers, recited in voices they didn't recognize, muttered from corners of cloisters where no one stood. Servants swore they woke to their own names, called in the dark, pulled from sleep by voices that belonged to long-deaded masters. A few even believed the whispers were messages, instructions from ancestors or saints, but more often, they were curses. You could wake to your sins laid bare in the rasping tones of the dead, reminders that no matter how tightly you bolted your chamber door, you were never alone. Chains, of course, were the favorite soundtrack of medieval hauntings, not the delicate jingling of metal, but the heavy stomach, turning drag of links that had bound prisoners in life. Castles doubled as dungeons, and many basements still held rusting iron restraints. People believed that those who died shackled were condemned to rattle their bonds forever, pacing endless circles in the dark. If you heard them in the night, it was not just an inconvenience, but a threat. It meant a spirit was still shackled near you, unable to rest, and perhaps looking for someone living to share its fate. No one in their right mind ignored the sound of chains on stone. You shift under the covers, telling yourself it's superstition. Yet, You feel the air change. It grows colder, denser, as if breath itself has been sucked from the room. The whispers fade, replaced by a long, mournful moan that rises from the hall. That was another common alarm clock of the medieval world, the wailing of the dead. In every castle, someone claimed to hear it. Sometimes a child lost to plague, sometimes a murdered guard, sometimes no story attached at all. Just a voice that didn't stop until you rose from your bed, as though the ghost itself were dragging you toward the day's work. For medieval people, this wasn't entertainment. It wasn't a campfire tale to be retold with a smile. These sounds carried weight. They were messages. A knock could mean illness. A whisper could mean betrayal. A chain could mean damnation. Life was already short, filled with war, famine, and plague. To add spirits into the mix was simply to confirm what everyone already suspected, that death was never more than a breath away, and sometimes it wanted company. As you sit up in your massive bed, curtains swaying from some unseen draft, you realize how cruel this particular kind of haunting is. Sleep was rare enough in the medieval world. The straw mattresses were lumpy, the cold relentless, the fleas merciless. Rest was precious, and yet, just as you began to drift, the ghost stole that too, reminding you with every creak and groan that your body belonged as much to the grave as to the day. You weren't just waking up, you were waking into their world. The whispers return, clearer this time, as though whoever is speaking has leaned in closer. The words are not in any language you recognize, but they pull at you all the same, tinged with urgency. You clutch the blanket tighter, but the chain drags again, circling the bed now, moving slowly, as though someone unseen is deciding whether to climb in beside you. Your heart races, and for a moment, you think about bolting from the room. But what waits in the corridor? More chains, more whispers, and then you realize the cruelest truth of all. In a castle like this, no matter where you go, you're still inside the same walls that have soaked up centuries of misery. You can't leave. You can only listen. The knocks, the whispers, the chains. They are not meant to terrify you into running. They are meant to remind you that in a place built for survival, the dead have their own schedule. You wanted a rooster, you got a ghost, and your morning has only just begun. You think a bed inside a castle tower would feel like a prize. Heavy stone walls, thick wooden doors, a bed big enough to stretch out without bumping into siblings or livestock. But the truth seeps in quickly. Your mattress is a sack of straw that squeaks with every movement and smells faintly of mold. Fleas crawl across your skin in the dark, biting until you scratch yourself raw. The wool blanket meant to keep you warm is damp and itchy, and no matter how tightly you wrap it around you, the cold from the stones presses in like a second skin. Castles are built to keep enemies out, not to keep their residents comfortable, and the result is a room that feels more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. It would be bad enough if it ended there, but you're not alone. No matter how tightly you shut the shutters, no matter how you stack your shoes by the door to feel like someone has claimed the space, there is always a sense that another presence is watching. Medieval people didn't need convincing. To them, bedrooms were places where the veil between the living and the dead wore thin. They spoke of cold, spots that crept across the bed in the middle of the night, patches of air so icy they made your teeth chatter even when the fire burned hot. When you shifted to escape them, they moved too, settling against your chest or sliding down to your feet as though something unseen had decided to lie beside you. And then there were the sighs. You could hear them when the castle grew quiet just before you fell asleep. Long, heavy breaths that didn't belong to you. Sometimes they came from the corner of the room, sometimes from just behind your ear. Men, at arms hardened from battle, swore they woke to the sound of someone sighing above their heads. Though the rafters were empty, servants whispered of ghostly breath, brushing their necks while they turned on their straw pallets, too afraid to open their eyes in case they saw the source. The sighs were not friendly. They were weary, resentful, the kind of sound that made you wonder if someone had lain in your bed centuries ago and still hadn't left. But nothing compared to what appeared at the foot of the bed. The stories all sound the same. A figure, faint and pale, standing in silence just beyond your toes. Sometimes it wore armor, sometimes a gown, sometimes only a shadow shaped like a man. You woke half asleep, blinking in the dark, and for a few moments you thought it was a dream, but then it didn't move, or it leaned closer, and you realized dreams don't make your blood turn to ice. Nobles claimed to see the ghosts of their ancestors, lords pacing with unfinished business. Servants said they saw strangers, faces they didn't know, staring with hollow eyes, as if deciding whether to step closer. Children described women who wept silently, dripping water onto the stones. Though no one could find where it came from, there are records of knights refusing to sleep in certain chambers after seeing shadow figures gather at their bedsides, watching with a patience that stretched into dawn. Monks confessed to being shaken awake, not by a hand, but by the sudden appearance of someone kneeling at their feet, praying in a language they couldn't understand. Some people believed these figures were omens of death. If you saw one, someone in the household would be gone before the month ended. Others thought they were trapped souls, people who had died violently within the castle walls, doomed to repeat the moment of their last breath beside whoever occupied their old resting place. Either way, no one wanted to share a bed with them, and yet you had no choice. Castle life didn't allow for moving rooms whenever you felt uneasy. You slept where you were told, even if that meant curling up under blankets with a shadow shifting at the edge of the bed. So, you pulled the wool tighter around you, shut your eyes, and prayed. Sometimes the prayers worked, sometimes they didn't. There are stories of people waking pinned to their mattresses, unable to move as cold fingers pressed against their chests. They called it the hag's weight, a spirit sitting on your body to steal your breath. Victims swore they could see her hunched form crouched on their ribs, her eyes gleaming, her grin wide enough to make their hearts stutter. Even those who escaped, the weight weren't safe. Flickering torches often threw tricks on the walls, and people described shadows that moved against the grain of the light. They weren't cast by fire or furniture, but by figures, pacing slowly, circling the bed as though hunting something. You could turn to follow them, but they always slipped just out of view, leaving you clutching at covers with your heart hammering in your ears. Worse were the nights when whispers rose in tandem with the movements, a dozen voices murmuring, layered over each other, some high, some low, none of them words you could make out. And when you finally found the courage to sit up, the voices stopped, the shadows froze, and all that remained was the pounding of your own heart. Imagine trying to rest in such a place. Every sound became a warning. Every creak of timber or sigh of wind through the arrow. You already know that medieval life offered little privacy. Your family, your neighbors, sometimes even your animals, all lived within arm's reach, sharing walls, air, and body heat. Solitude was a luxury reserved for no one. Yet in castles, the lack of privacy carried another layer, something far more unsettling. Even when the halls were quiet, even when the last servant had retired and the torches smoldered low, you were never truly alone. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with unseen company, and those who spent their nights within them swore they shared their chambers with more than just fleas and restless relatives. It was an accepted truth that castles came with their own population of invisible roommates, ghosts, spirits, shades, whatever name you gave them, they were part of the household. Some claimed they were former servants, still dutiful in death, gliding through corridors with phantom trays and brooms, performing chores no one asked for anymore. Guests spoke of hearing footsteps pacing through empty kitchens at night, pots rattling when no one cooked, or brooms scratching stone floors without leaving a trace of swept dust. These were not malicious spirits, but they weren't exactly comforting either. The thought of being watched by hands that once scrubbed your chamber pot long after those hands had rotted away made sleep difficult. More disturbing were the nights, the mournful kind, always armored, always dragging their swords, as if their burdens followed them beyond the grave. They appeared most often to squires and guards on night watch, emerging silently from shadowed doorways or rising from stairwells as though they had never stopped patrolling, faces hidden behind helmets. They never spoke. They only stared. Some bowed their heads in silent misery before disappearing into the walls, while others walked straight through a man as if he were mist, leaving him shivering for hours afterward. Rumor held that these were soldiers who had failed their lords, dying dishonorably, condemned to guard halls they could never leave. Sleeping in a castle with such company meant lying in bed, listening for the scrape of phantom steel across stone, and praying that the footsteps would fade before they reached your door. And then there were the women, the most whispered about of all, the ladies in white. Every castle had at least one, and she was always the same, pale, veiled, clad in flowing white robes that shimmered faintly in the dark. She did not clatter like the knights, nor shuffle like the servants. She drifted, silent through doorways and across chambers, pausing often at bedsides to watch the living breathe. Some said she was a bride who died before her wedding, still searching for her groom. Others swore she was a nun buried alive for breaking vows, condemned to wander in shame. Children grew up with stories that she snatched away those who lingered, awake after midnight, carrying them into walls, never to be seen again. What everyone agreed upon was her presence, the icy silence before she appeared, the way the air seemed to thicken with sorrow, and the absolute terror of waking to find her motionless figure at the end of your bed. Living in such company meant constant unease. Torches sputtered, without reason. Curtains stirred when there was no draft, and you always felt watched. Servants told tales of invisible hands adjusting their bedding at night or smoothing hair from their foreheads like a mother might. Nobles muttered of shadows leaning too close when they tried to write by candlelight. In the laundry rooms, women insisted that unseen fingers plucked at their skirts as they scrubbed tunics in icy water. And in the great halls, visitors often left their goblets untouched because they swore a second hand had gripped it with them. The boundaries between living and dead blurred until you accepted that the unseen lived just as fully within those walls as you did. The worst part was that no one questioned it. Ghosts weren't unusual. They weren't considered a flaw in castle living, but a fact of it. People expected to share their spaces with the dead the way you might expect to share an apartment with noisy neighbors. If your sleep was broken by moaning in the corridor, you rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter. If you glimpsed a shadowed figure in your doorway, you whispered a prayer and hoped it moved on. The spirits were roommates you hadn't chosen but couldn't evict. You lived alongside them because to acknowledge them too much might invite them closer, and sometimes they did more than watch. People told of being touched by hands that weren't there, a sudden grip on the wrist, a cold palm pressed against the cheek, a tug at the ankle dragging you awake from sleep. There are records of noblemen refusing to stay in certain chambers after being shaken violently in their beds by unseen figures. Servants were found huddled on the floors of storerooms, trembling, claiming they had been chased by laughter, echoing down corridors with no visible source. More than one chronicler wrote that castles with the most haunting seemed almost alive themselves, their walls groaning with sorrow and anger, their halls echoing with memories no priest could banish. Imagine trying to sleep in a world where you could hear chains dragging on stone in the middle of the night, only to wake and find your door barred from the inside when you hadn't touched it, or lying still as an icy presence stretched across your mattress and settled beside you, weightless but undeniable, or listening to whispers that rose from the floorboards, conversations in languages long forgotten, spoken by voices with no bodies attached. You might tell yourself it was imagination, a trick of exhaustion, the castle creaking with age. But then the sighs would come. The footsteps would return. The lady in white would drift silently past your door, and you would know in a medieval castle you never slept alone. Not really. Breakfast in a medieval castle is never the cheerful affair you might imagine. There are no steaming cups of coffee, no sweet rolls dusted with sugar, no comforting smell of bacon sizzling in a pan. Instead, you sit in a cold hall at a rough Hunid table, and a servant slaps down a bowl of pottage that has been simmering for days. It's a sludge of barley, beans, and yesterday's turnips, thick enough to stand a spoon in, and thin enough to taste like nothing at all. The bread beside it is rock hard, and you have to soak it just to gnaw a piece off without cracking a tooth. All of that is miserable enough, but here in this castle, breakfast comes with something else, a presence, a reminder that you are never eating alone. The kitchen is where it begins. At first glance, it looks like chaos. Smoke rising from the great hearth, cauldrons hung on hooks, wooden spoons clattering, and servants rushing to feed a hungry household. But stay a little longer, and you'll notice something is off. Pots bubble when no fire burns beneath them. Cauldrons sway on their chains as though stirred by invisible hands. Servants whisper that sometimes the ladle dips itself, swirling the contents without anyone touching it. At dawn, when the first blur-eyed cook enters, they find the tables already set with bowls, though no one admits to laying them out. One young scullion swore he caught a glimpse of pale hands kneading dough on their own, the flour rising and falling, as if pressed by fingers made of air. The smells are worse than the sights. Sometimes, in the middle of choking down your stale pottage, a wave of roasted meat drifts through the hall, rich, savory, mouth-watering. You look up, expecting to see a haunch of venison carried in, but nothing comes. The scent lingers, cruel and taunting, until it fades back into the stench of boiled grains. Others report the opposite. A sudden reek of rot, of sour milk, or decaying flesh, curling up from the very food in their bowls. Guests have been known to push away their meals, gagging even as their neighbors insist they smell nothing at all. To eat here is to wonder if what you taste is real, or if the dead have slipped their hands into the meal. And sometimes they show themselves. Stories spread of starving peasants appearing at the edge of the tables, their bodies thin, their eyes sunken, their mouths open in silent hunger. They don't touch the food, they only watch, lips trembling as if begging for a bite. They will never receive. When you blink, they vanish, but not before leaving behind a wave of guilt that makes every spoonful of pottage sit like a stone in your stomach. Lords dismissed such tales, calling them peasant superstition, yet even nobles confessed to shivering when they saw shadows kneel at the benches, mouths open in endless prayer or endless hunger. There are other apparitions, less pitiful, more unnerving. Entire feasts have been reported, not of the living, but of the dead. Candlelight flickers to reveal tables crowded with translucent figures, all seated in silence, their hands moving in slow ritual as though they were eating. They lift invisible goblets, cut into air with knives, and chew nothing. Those who witnessed it described hearing the faint clink of cups and the scrape of knives across plates. Though no dish had been set, no wine had been poured. If you walked closer, the figures would turn to look at you, their faces pale and hollow, and then the vision would dissolve, leaving you standing alone with only your own bowl of pottage. The danger lay not just in the visions, but in the food itself. Cursed meals were a fear that lived in every corner of the castle. Priests warned that the dead sometimes tainted bread or meat to punish the living. Eat a cursed loaf, and you might waste away in weeks, your body growing thinner, though you never stopped eating. Drink from a goblet offered in a vision, and you could die before sunset, your throat burning with unseen fire. There are accounts of men finding worms writhing in their pottage the moment they raised a spoon, only for the worms to vanish when dropped back into the bowl. Women told of biting into bread that tasted of ashes, as though baked from the bones of the dead. So breakfast was not just miserable, it was dangerous. Every meal carried questions you dared not ask aloud. Was the bread baked by mortal hands, or had it been touched by something else in the kitchen during the night? Was the stew safe to swallow, Or would it fill you with more than beans and barley? The servants muttered prayers before they ate, crossing themselves quickly, trying to keep whatever unseen thing shared the meal at bay. Nobles hired priests to bless the kitchens, yet the whispers and the smells returned as soon as the holy water dried. You shoveled in a spoonful of pottage anyway, because you must. Hunger doesn't wait for ghosts, but as you chew the thick, tasteless mass, you can't ignore the faint weight at the bench beside you, the sensation of someone sitting close enough that you feel the air shift with them. You try not to look, but your eyes flicker sideways, all the same. There's no one there, or rather, there is no one visible. The truth settles in with every mouthful. Meals are not a comfort here. They are an invitation. To eat in a haunted castle is to dine with those who never left, to share your bread with the restless and the damned, and to wonder if one day you'll be the one haunting the benches at breakfast, waiting in silence for food that will never come. You step into the corridor, and for a moment it feels ordinary, just a long stretch of stone passage, torchlight flickering on damp walls, and the sound of your own boots against the floor. But in castles, the halls are alive in ways that defy sense. The stone doesn't just hold the cold, it holds every sound that has ever passed through it. A cough echoes tenfold. A whisper stretches down the length of the hall, and footsteps multiply until you're not sure if you're hearing yourself or something following close behind. The castle makes sure you never feel alone, even when you are. Servants knew this better than anyone. They walked these halls at all hours, carrying water, hauling firewood, fetching messages for lords who barked commands and expected obedience. They spoke of voices that weren't their own, drifting from corners where no one stood. A woman calling softly by name, a man muttering as though reciting prayers, children giggling in places no children lived. At first you might tell yourself, it's just the echo of others working nearby. But when you follow the sound and find nothing, when you realize the whispers repeat phrases that no one around you ever said, that's when the hairs on your neck rise and your pace quickens. The acoustics of a castle play tricks. Torches sputter, and the hiss rolls across the ceiling like a breath from something unseen. Chains clink in the armory, and the sound snakes through the walls until it feels as if they're rattling right behind your ear. Some of the corridors are narrow, hemmed in by arches, while others open into vaulted passageways where your own steps boom like drums. But layered into those natural echoes are patterns too deliberate to dismiss. Rhythms that don't match your stride. Footsteps that begin only after you stop. The faint scrape of fabric brushing stone, as though someone in a long gown has just turned the corner ahead of you. Knights, men who bled on battlefields without flinching, spoke of these sounds with lowered voices. They confessed to hearing armored footsteps pacing behind them, measured and heavy, though when they spun around, the corridor was bare. Some claimed they saw faint glimmers, like the reflection of moonlight off a helm, only for it to vanish when approached. To the common people, it was simple. The dead were walking the halls. A slain knight, unable to rest, forever patrolled the castle he once defended. Others believed the spirits were guards, testing the loyalty of the living, ensuring that those who slept within the stone walls remembered the cost of keeping them safe. It wasn't only footsteps. Sometimes the walls themselves seemed to breathe, stand still long enough, and you could swear you heard a low sigh seep from the cracks, carried down the corridor in a draft that made your torch sputter. The sighs came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, like someone crying softly out of sight. A maid carrying laundry after sunset swore she heard a woman sobbing in the passage near the chapel, but when she stepped closer, the sound darted away, pulling her along until she realized she'd wandered into the dark heart of the castle. With no torch left to guide her, she fled and told no one for days, until her silence became unbearable. Others claimed to hear laughter instead. High, brittle laughter that broke suddenly, as if whoever laughed realized they were being overheard. Doors didn't always help. In some castles, they swore voices slipped through wood and iron as though nothing could contain them. Entire households reported nights when the corridors seemed filled with chatter, a crowd just out of sight, servants huddled together, unable to sleep, listening as muffled words passed up and down the length of the hall, punctuated by the thud of unseen feet. And then, as suddenly as it started, the noise would cut off, leaving only silence so deep it made their ears ring. People grew superstitious about certain corridors. Some were avoided after dark, with excuses about drafts or crumbling mortar, though everyone knew it was because too many had heard the same whispered name, the same measured tread that never came from a living person. Messengers sometimes refused to take the long passage between the great hall and the chapel after sundown, saying the stones there amplified every sound until it felt like dozens walked beside you. A few claimed to have seen shapes in the flickering torchlight, shadows that didn't belong to anybody, stretching across the walls and then melting away. For those who lived inside castles, these experiences weren't unusual. They were expected. The idea of a quiet corridor simply didn't exist. Castles were built on layers of death, sieges, and betrayals, and people believed the walls soaked it all in. What echoed back at night wasn't just the sound of the living, but the memories of the dead replaying themselves. Sometimes they were warnings, sometimes they were punishments, and sometimes they were just restless remnants, caught pacing and whispering forever in the halls they had once known in life. You walk faster now, torch clutched tight, the echo of your steps doubling back until you're sure someone's behind you. You turn, heart pounding, but the corridor yawns empty, shadows stretching and curling against the stones. You tell yourself it's just the echo, just the castle playing its tricks. But deep down, you know the truth. Castles never sleep, and neither do the ghosts in their halls. Congratulations! You've just stumbled into the worst room in the castle. Not the dungeon, not the armory, not even the drafty hall where nobles shout themselves hoarse over supper. No, this particular chamber is smaller, darker, and infinitely more humiliating. You've found the garderobe, the medieval toilet, and if you thought it couldn't get worse, then perching over a hole that drops your business directly into a pit or moat, brace yourself. Because here in the castle, you're not alone, not even when you're trying to answer nature's call. The very design of the place is already an insult to dignity. A cold stone alcove, barely wide enough for your knees, with a wooden bench riddled with splinters, and an opening that gapes like a hungry mouth. The draft that rushes up from below is frigid in winter, rank in summer, and always carrying the perfume of centuries of unfortunate deposits. Forget candles or comfort. You crouch in the dark, torchlight flickering from the hall, praying you don't slip. The pit yawns beneath you, filled with a stew of human waste, rainwater, animal carcasses, and whatever unlucky object someone dropped last week. It's disgusting, it's humiliating, and in many castles, it's haunted. People swore they heard voices rising with the stench, not muffled conversation from courtyards or kitchens, but whispers that seemed to hiss right through the stone chute. One servant claimed she heard her own name called from the depths while she sat alone, the syllables stretched and distorted, as though pulled through water. Another spoke of a wet laugh echoing up, too deep to belong to anything human. The sound would grow louder the longer you stayed, until you bolted out red-faced trousers, half-fastened, willing to risk public shame, rather than listen another second. But the real terror wasn't just sound, it was touch. Stories spread of spectral hands, clawing their way up from the pit, fingers slick with filth, reaching for the poor soul perched above. One knight swore on his honor that a cold grip latched onto his ankle mid-visit, tugging until he fell sideways and split his head against the wall. He survived, but he refused to use the garter-robe again, preferring the relative safety of the woods, even during sieges. He insisted the hand belonged to a drowned spirit, someone thrown into the cesspit alive as punishment, now doomed to drag others into the same foul grave. Demons, too, were thought to crawl in through waste chutes. Priests warned that garter robes were portals of impurity, doors left wide open for whatever evil wished to slip into the castle. And honestly, they weren't wrong. A hole in the wall leading directly outside was basically an invitation. One tale from Scotland told of a guard who vanished during the night watch, only to be found days later, wedged in the latrine shaft, his face twisted in terror, eyes wide, as if he'd seen something crawl up toward him before he drowned in filth. Was it an accident, an assassination, or something darker? No one wanted to dwell on the possibility. If you were lucky enough to be a noble, your chamber might include a private garter robe, a hole tucked discreetly into the corner. Privacy, however, didn't mean safety. Whispered tales told of spectral figures peering through the opening as you sat, pale faces rising from the depths, mouths moving silently, eyes unblinking. Some insisted these were the spirits of the starved, those who died of hunger in the dungeons below, now reaching up for scraps of life wherever they could find it. Others thought they were demons mocking human shame, turning the most basic act of survival into a carnival of fear. And then there was the smell. The reek of waste wasn't just physical. People believed it carried spirits with it. Miasmas, the bad airs of the medieval world, weren't just disease, but curses drifting up from below. A whiff of the wrong draft while you relieved yourself could mark you, they said, staining your soul as much as your lungs. One chronicler even claimed that during a particularly foul summer, an entire garrison fell ill after using the same latrine, their bowels cursed by the angry ghost of a servant who had drowned there. months earlier. Children of servants were told bedtime warnings. Never linger too long in the garter-robe. Don't look down. Don't answer if you hear your name. Don't let your feet dangle, because if you did, the pit might claim you. It was the medieval version of a jump scare. Spectral hands, sudden whispers, cold drafts that felt like breath against your thighs. Congratulations, you've just invented horror movies, only without the benefit of popcorn or a screen to keep the monsters at a safe distance. Of course, people adapted. Some prayed before entering, muttering quick invocations to saints as though warding off both the smell and whatever lurked beneath it. Others hung charms on the wall, carved crosses, sprigs of herbs, even scraps of parchment, with holy words scrolled in clumsy Latin. Guards sometimes posted watch near communal latrines after too many reports of moving shadows. None of it helped. The guardrobe remained what it always was, a place of filth, fear, and humiliation, a perfect breeding ground for the supernatural. And here's the cruelest detail. Even when you escaped the room, the memory lingered. The echo of whispers clung to your ears. The sensation of fingers brushing your skin haunted you long after you washed. Every time you passed the corridor leading to the garter-robe, you felt eyes on you, waiting, patient, because in a castle filled with restless spirits, the toilet was never just a toilet. It was a trap. You'd laugh if it weren't so grim. The mighty fortress with battlements and towers, the seat of kings and knights, reduced to a haunted privy where your worst fear wasn't enemy arrows, but being yanked, screaming into a pit of waste by something you couldn't see. It's grotesque, it's humiliating, and it's exactly the kind of everyday terror that made medieval life less like a fairy tale and more like a nightmare. So, sit carefully, keep your feet planted, and whatever you do, don't look down for too long, because the garter-robe has a way of looking back. You don't have a mirror in your chamber. Glass that's smooth and polished is a luxury far beyond your reach, reserved for the wealthiest courts and churches. What you have instead are makeshift substitutes: a basin of water darkened by shadow, a polished plate of bronze dulled by years of use, or the slick shine of a narrow window when the moonlight hits it just right. And though none of these things were designed to hold your face, they often do, or at least they should. The problem is that in a haunted castle, they don't always reflect back what you expect. You lean over the basin to wash your face and pause. The water ripples slightly from your breath, and there you are, staring back, tired and pale, in the cold light of dawn. But as the ripples settle, the features seem wrong. The mouth curls down, just a fraction too far. The eyes hold a glare you don't remember making. And before you can convince yourself, it's just exhaustion. The reflected face blinks half a second after you do. That's when the water tips from tool to trap, a surface no longer reflecting your body, but some other presence using it as a window. People whispered of this for centuries, that water could capture the soul, that reflections could trap the essence of a person, and that sometimes those who died violently never left the mirror at all. Polished metal was no safer. Nobles with the luxury of bronze or silver hand mirrors often grew uneasy after dark, when the flickering of torches distorted the images within. A servant polishing one might glimpse more than their own dirt-smudged face, a pale woman hovering behind their shoulder, or a knight in armor whose lips moved as if whispering through the centuries. Once a chambermaid swore she saw the face of her dead brother glaring back at her from the polished tray she carried into the great hall. He had drowned in the moat weeks earlier, and she dropped the tray, screaming, certain his soul had been trapped in the metal by the water that took him. The lord of the castle dismissed her tale as hysteria, but when 3 other servants reported the same face that month, the tray was quietly melted down. And then there were the windows, those tall, narrow slits carved into the stone walls for light and arrows. By day, they let in cold air and dust. By night, they became black mirrors. You might catch your own silhouette if you leaned too close, but often the shape that gazed back wasn't yours. Some swore the faces in the glass were warnings, omens of who would die next. A squire, polishing armor at dusk, claimed he saw a face in the arrow's slit, staring back at him, mouth stretched wide, in a silent scream. He laughed nervously at first, until he realized it was his own face. He was thrown from a horse and killed the following week. Word spread quickly, and soon no one dared look into the windows after sunset, preferring darkness to whatever waited in the glass. The fear wasn't just born of stories. Medieval superstition taught that reflections weren't harmless copies, but echoes of the soul itself. To see yourself was to risk dividing your spirit, leaving a part of it exposed to theft or corruption. That was why mirrors, when they did exist, were often covered after a death. It wasn't simply respect. It was to prevent the spirit of the newly dead from getting trapped in the surface and lingering to torment the living, and in castles already soaked with grief, betrayal, and blood. The threat felt all too real. Imagine lying in your drafty chamber, moonlight falling across a polished goblet beside your bed. You turn in your sleep, eyes half open, and see a figure leaning over you in the reflection, pale and robed, lips parted in a sigh you can't hear. You sit up with a start, and the figure is gone, but the goblet still trembles slightly, as though touched by unseen fingers. Do you keep drinking from it the next morning, or do you hurl it out the window and pray the spirit follows it down into the dark? Stories multiplied. Castles across Europe claimed to host their own cursed reflections. At one in Wales, they spoke of a mirror so polished it showed not just faces, but futures. Any who looked into it after midnight saw themselves pale and lifeless, eyes sunken, a vision of their own corpse. A young page who dared to test it laughed at the tale until he looked, and 3 weeks later was found dead in his bed without a mark on him. At another fortress in Germany, they whispered of a pool in the courtyard where no one dared to linger after dusk. Supposedly, the water showed the faces of those buried beneath the stones, pressing upward as though begging to be remembered, their mouths moving in silent pleas for prayers. The terror wasn't always gruesome. Sometimes it was subtle, cruel in its understatement. A noble woman in France once confessed to her confessor that she could no longer look into her bronze mirror, because every time she did, she saw not her own face, but that of an older woman, lined with grief and age. She begged for absolution, certain it was a curse. a reflection of the misery waiting for her. And when she died decades later, alone and bitter, her maids swore she had come to resemble the very face she'd seen long before. But perhaps the most unnerving truth was this: you were never sure if the faces were ghosts or simply tricks of your mind. Flickering torchlight made reflections twitch unnaturally, warped metal-bent features into grotesque shapes. Pools of water rippled with drafts, distorting faces into strangers. And yet, when enough people reported the same visions, the woman in white at the window, the knight in the silver tray, the drowned boy in the basin, you began to wonder whether the castle itself was holding on to souls, replaying them again and again in its reflective surfaces. In the end, reflection became something to fear as much as darkness. Servants learned to avoid basins at night. Nobles kept their mirrors covered, and even windows were approached with caution after sundown. Because when you live in a castle, thick with stone and silence, it isn't the shadows you fear most. It's the face that stares back at you from the glass, breathing when you do not, blinking when you don't, and smiling just a little too long. By day, a castle was a machine of endless labor. Servants rushed through kitchens, carrying dripping ladles of pottage. Stable boys shoveled manure. Blacksmiths hammered at red-hot iron until their arms ached, and masons chipped away at crumbling walls to keep the place standing. But at night, when the torches guttered low and the last worker staggered to bed, the labor didn't always stop. Instead, it often continued in eerie silence, or worse, in sounds no one could trace. Medieval chronicles are filled with stories of phantom workers, spectral servants, invisible masons, ghostly blacksmiths who seemed condemned to keep the castle alive long after their bodies had gone to dust. You might think a haunted castle would be defined by clanking chains and pale figures drifting through walls, but more often, it was the noises of toil that unsettled residents. A blacksmith in Normandy claimed he could still hear hammering on iron long after the forge fire had gone out. The clang of the anvil echoed in the night, measured and rhythmic, though when he entered the workshop, there was nothing but a cold hearth and tools laid neatly in their places. Stable boys reported hearing horses being brushed in empty stalls, hooves shifting, as if an invisible hand guided them. One swore he heard the creak of saddles being tightened when no rider had passed through the gate for weeks. Servants whispered that the castle itself remembered their labor, replaying it in an endless loop, as though the stones were unwilling to release the sweat and suffering that built them. The most chilling stories came from the kitchens. Cooks spoke of pots stirring themselves long after the fire had burned low, or the smell of roasting meat filling the hall when no animal had been slaughtered that day. One noblewoman complained of waking each night to the sound of knives chopping on a wooden block, the steady rhythm of meal preparation. Yet every time her servants checked, they found only empty boards in cold kitchens. Some began to believe that the ghosts were starving, condemned to cook meals that no one could ever eat. Others argued that these were echoes, the castle walls replaying the busiest, most frantic hours, embedding the sounds of labor into their very mortar. There was a darker side to these hauntings. Building a castle was brutal work, often done by conscripted peasants who hauled stone, dug mows, and endured injuries that today would be fatal. without medical care. Some died mid-construction, crushed under falling blocks, or buried in collapses of earth. Folklore whispered that their spirits never left. They had given their lives to the castle, and the castle had claimed them. In certain strongholds, masons swore they could hear chisels tapping at night, the slow scrape of stone shaping stone. Sometimes, workers returning early in the morning found new chips and grooves carved into unfinished walls, as if invisible laborers had continued their tasks while the living slept. Rather than inspiring awe, these signs filled them with dread. No one wanted to believe that death was not an escape from toil. Chroniclers often tied these phantom workers to curses. In Wales, one tale described a fortress where the foundations repeatedly collapsed during construction. After dozens of peasants died in accidents, the local lord finally finished the walls. But the ghostly sounds of picks and shovels haunted the place for generations. Locals claimed the dead workers had been bound to the site, their Unku souls hammering through eternity. In Germany, a legend told of a blacksmith who cheated his apprentices of wages. They died in poverty, but their hammering never ceased, and soon even the Lord complained of sleepless nights filled with metallic clanging. The smith eventually abandoned his forge, but the villagers said they could still hear the apprentices working, forging weapons no one would ever wield. Some lords tried to sanctify these hauntings with prayers and blessings. Priests were called to sprinkle holy water through kitchens, to mutter Latin verses in the stables, to carry incense through workshops where invisible hands still labored. Sometimes the noises quieted, only to return months later, louder than before, as if mocking the attempts to silence them. Servants developed their own defenses, leaving out scraps of bread in kitchens to feed the hungry dead, or whispering apologies to the air before stoking the forge. These rituals were desperate acts of respect, or perhaps bargaining, acknowledging that the ghosts were co-workers in their own strange way. The terror of phantom workers wasn't simply their presence. It was the reminder of what life in a castle really cost. Behind the stone towers and shining banners was a hidden ledger of suffering. Thousands of hands had cut, hauled, and hammered, and many of those hands had bled into the earth beneath the walls. To hear those sounds at night was to be confronted with that sacrifice, to realize that comfort and safety were bought not with gold, but with human endurance and human lives. And if the dead were still working, what did that say about the justice of the world? That even in death a peasant could not rest, still bound to labor for a lord who had long since joined them in the grave. Imagine yourself lying awake in the drafty chamber of a haunted keep. Outside, the night is silent, except for the wind scratching at arrows' slits. And then it begins, a hammer striking metal, steady and relentless, the scrape of a broom across stone, sweeping up dust that has already returned, the creak of a wheelbarrow moving down a passage where no one walks. You strain to convince yourself it's the wind, the settling of timber, the scurrying of mice. But the rhythm is too precise, the noise is too familiar. These are the sounds of work, of hands repeating motions they've known for centuries. You don't see them, but you can almost picture it. A sweating blacksmith's shadow lifting a hammer, a servant carrying water buckets, a mason bending to his stone. The room grows colder with each sound, as if the labor of the dead has chilled the very air around you. Some ghosts frighten because they threaten violence. Others terrify because they remind you of suffering. Phantom workers fall into the second category. They don't attack or scream. They toil. They toil without end, without relief, invisible and eternal. And that might be the worst haunting of all. Not a ghoul dragging chains or a specter dripping blood, but the endless clanging echo of labor that never stops, long after the flesh has rotted from bone. Because in a medieval castle, even death couldn't free you from work. The stones remembered, and they demanded you remember too. You drift into uneasy sleep, the straw mattress scratching at your skin, the wool blanket itching at your neck when the sound of boots on stone jolts you awake. Heavy, measured, deliberate, they march along the battlements above your chamber. At first, you think it's the night watch guards patrolling the walls, checking for raiders or thieves, but then you remember the castle is silent, its garrison long gone. The wars that filled these halls reduced to yellowed parchments and fading tapestries. Still the steps keep coming, circling the walls with an unhurried precision, as if an army that never left is still carrying out its nightly duty. And in a way, it is, because this isn't just a castle, it's a battlefield that never stopped fighting. Castles were built for war, and they drank deeply of it. Their walls rang with a clash of steel, their courtyards soaked in blood, their towers filled with screams muffled by thick stone. Even after peace settled, the memory of violence seeped into the mortar like damp, and in the silence of midnight, that memory sometimes stirred. Soldiers who never went home kept watch. Knights who fell on the drawbridge rose again. Whole regiments, long buried beneath the earth, returned, moaning, clanking, dragging broken weapons across the yard. The living called them ghosts, but they were something else too. Echoes of duty that refused to die. Imagine standing on a parapet in the misty dark, looking down at the field where a skirmish had once raged. Suddenly, the air grows heavy, colder than the chill of the night. Then the faint clang of armor carries through the fog. Figures rise where none should be, pale shapes holding lances that no longer exist, riding horses that leave no hoofprints. Their eyes are hollow, their banners shredded, but they march anyway. A spectral army locked in a campaign that never ends. Chroniclers wrote of moaning hosts sweeping across moors near castles, their cries like the wind but sharper, as if mourning and warning at once. To peasants who saw them, these weren't just memories. They were the damned knights, unable to return home because their honor, their oath, or their death had trapped them in eternal service. The most famous of these phantoms were the headless horsemen, ghostly riders who galloped along the walls or across fields, carrying their heads beneath their arms, or not at all. They were said to be nobles who died in ambush, messengers slain before they could deliver their word, or knights executed for betrayal. Without their heads, they could never rest, cursed to ride endlessly in search of something they would never find. Villagers told tales of hearing the pounding hooves on quiet nights, the sound rattling shutters, and vibrating through floors, though no horse could be seen, and if you dared look out a window, you might glimpse the rider, cloak whipping, sword glinting faintly, galloping through the night like the battlefield was still alive. But the most unnerving hauntings weren't the dramatic ones. They were the small, constant reminders, guards who patrolled walls that had no watch, footsteps, pacing towers where no centuries had stood for centuries, the creak of leather straps being tightened, the rattle of chainmail adjusted before a battle that never came. Servants swore they saw soldiers in doorways leaning on spears, waiting silently until they faded back into shadow. One tale from Scotland told of a spectral guard at the gate, saluting travelers as they passed through, his face hidden beneath a helm, his gesture mechanical. He never spoke. He never left. He only saluted until the next soul approached. Some believe these were not just restless spirits, but warnings. A garrison reappearing before a siege meant the castle would soon face danger again. A headless rider galloping near the walls was thought to foretell the death of a lord. Ghostly armies wailing across the night sky were omens of famine, plague, or invasion. People lived surrounded by war, and so they believed war itself lingered after death. To them, these apparitions weren't accidents. They were reminders that the violence of the past was always waiting just beneath the soil, ready to rise again. And yet there was pity in these stories too. Knights were supposed to return home, to feast, to rest, to tell their tales around the fire. But many never did. They died on foreign soil, on bridges, in mud pits, their families never knowing their fate. To see them patrolling the walls was to be reminded of unfinished business. Soldiers robbed of closure. Some priests claim to have offered masses for the lost, ringing bells and chanting prayers to release them from duty. Sometimes the hauntings quieted after such rituals. Sometimes they only grew louder, as if offended by the attempt to end their eternal march. Now imagine yourself lying awake, hearing those boots again on the stones above. They are steady, disciplined, impossibly clear. You want to believe it's your imagination, the settling of masonry, the shifting of rafters. But the sound is too precise, the cadence too military. Step, 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 pause, step, 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 pause. Exactly the rhythm of a guard scanning the walls for enemies. You know no one is there, yet you picture him anyway. A soldier in rusted armor, helmet dented, spear in hand, eyes hollow, still obeying orders, centuries after the commander who gave them rotted in the ground. And you realize something. He isn't guarding the castle. He's guarding you. Whether that comforts you or not depends on how much you believe in duty that outlives the flesh. Because in a medieval castle, the soldier who never went home is still waiting, still watching, still patrolling, and he will be there long after you leave. The castle dungeons are the part of the tour no one wants to linger in, but you don't get a choice. You're here, torch in hand, descending into a place where the air is thick and damp, clinging to your lungs like mold. The stone stairs curl downward, narrowing as you go. The weight of the fortress pressing overhead. You try to convince yourself it's just architecture, just cold air, and bad design. But when you step onto the packed earth of the dungeon floor and the silence settles in around you, you understand why so many refuse to enter without a priest's blessing. These weren't just prisons. They were chambers built for screams, and screams don't leave quietly. Every wall here has a history of suffering carved into it. Iron rings are still bolted to the stones meant to fasten wrists or ankles. Heavy chains dangle from ceilings, their links stained with rust that looks a little too much like dried blood. Wooden racks splinter in the corners, their gears long seized. But you can imagine them creaking under tension, groaning like the bones they once stretched. To walk through a medieval dungeon isn't to imagine cruelty, it's to breathe it. The dampness carries it, a musk of centuries-old agony, sweat, and something sharper. The scent of fear soaked so deeply into the walls, it never washed away. But worse than what you see is what you hear. At first, it's just the echo of your own steps, sharp and hollow, bouncing off stone. Then beneath it, you catch something softer, a whimper, maybe, or a groan. You stop moving, and the sound lingers. It doesn't belong to you. Some claim it's the castle settling, air squeezing through narrow cracks, but then the tone changes. The sigh becomes a sob. The sob becomes a scream, faint but unmistakable. A voice raw with terror, pleading with no one who can answer. In medieval times, people didn't dismiss this. They called it what it was, the voices of prisoners who never left. Many castles carried reputations for hauntings that centered in their dungeons. Guards reported chains rattling in empty cells. Priests sworn to hear confessions described unseen voices, whispering sins in their ears. Travelers passing nearby swore they heard weeping, leaking up from underground even when the doors were sealed. And these weren't vague rumors. Chroniclers wrote down specific cases. A man walking through a corridor, hearing footsteps running beside him, though he was alone. A servant fainting when she felt a cold hand grasp hers in the dark. An executioner driven mad by the constant sound of his own victims returning to accuse him in the silence of the night. The prisoners who fed these legends were not thieves caught in minor crimes. Castles often held traitors, rebels, enemies of lords, men and women condemned not just to die, but to suffer first. Torture was both punishment and performance, and it left behind scars deeper than the skin. When you spend days shackled in darkness, thirst burning your throat, rats crawling across your body, and the only relief is to scream, your final act becomes your legacy, and legacies have a way of sticking. Imagine dozens, hundreds of such voices layering century upon century until the dungeon is less a room than a reservoir of anguish. Step inside, and it spills out. Even the architecture amplifies it. Stone corridors carry sound in strange ways. A single cough in one cell can echo into another, as if whispered directly into an ear. A dropped chain clinks and multiplies, ringing until it seems there are 10 of them, not one. In daylight, you can explain it away as acoustics, but at midnight, when the torchlight flickers and shadows creep like liquid across the walls, acoustics become phantoms. A clank becomes a prisoner shifting in his bonds. A gust of air becomes a moan, and when a voice calls your name out of the dark, steady, and deliberate, you can tell yourself it's an illusion all you want, you still run. Some stories are darker still. It wasn't uncommon for the executed to haunt the place of their deaths. Beheadings were said to leave behind headless figures staggering through corridors, still searching for the blade that took them. Strangulations echoed in the form of gasping sounds in empty cells, as though someone were perpetually choking just beyond sight. One tale spoke of a woman walled up alive for treason. Centuries later, masons repairing the castle swore they heard scratching from behind the stones, desperate and frantic, though when they tore down the wall, there was nothing inside but dust, or so they claimed. For the medieval mind, these hauntings weren't strange. They were expected. If the soul of a murdered man could not rest, it would walk until justice was given. If a traitor died without repentance, he would wail until the end of days. The dungeon was never empty, because spiritually, it was always occupied. Lords sometimes invited priests to bless the chambers, to sprinkle holy water over every ring and stone, to chant psalms meant to soothe the dead. Sometimes the voices quieted. Sometimes they grew louder, as though mocking the attempt. The dead, after all, owed no obedience to the living. Now picture yourself standing in one of those cells. The air is stale, heavy, and every breath feels borrowed. You lean against the wall for comfort, only to feel it vibrate faintly, like something deep within it is still moving. A chain swings gently, though there's no draft. Your torchlight throws long shadows that tremble, like figures pressing against invisible bars. Then, faintly, a sound drifts through the chamber. It is a man's voice, hoarse arrow and cracked, begging, pleading, promising anything for mercy. You clutch the torch tighter, tell yourself it's your imagination, and then a second voice answers, this one a low growl, commanding, cruel, savoring the pain it inflicts. The conversation repeats, looped like a scar that never heals. You could flee, rush up the steps, slam the iron door, and tell yourself it was all tricks of sound and mind. But when you turn back one last time, you swear you see it. A figure in the far corner of the cell, shackled to the wall, his face pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth open in an endless scream. You can no longer hear. Then he fades. The torchlight flickers, and the dungeon is still again, except for the chains. They're still swinging. She comes at night, when the fire has burned low, and the corridors of the castle have gone silent, except for the drip of water through stone. You're half asleep, shifting on your straw mattress, when the air grows colder, in a way that isn't just draft, but something intentional, like frost settling inside your bones. That's when you see her, a pale figure at the end of the hall, standing perfectly still, her gown brushing the floor without a sound. Her face is hidden, veiled by shadow or by hair, but you know without question that she is watching you. No one announces her. No footsteps led to her arrival. She is simply there. And the only thing more terrifying than her presence is the knowledge that she has been here before and will return again. Every castle in Europe seemed to have one, a spectral woman lingering long after her body had been buried. Sometimes she wore white, sometimes gray, sometimes black, but her presence always meant sorrow. These weren't random phantoms. They were archetypes carved into collective memory. The lady in white forever, mourning the loss of children she could not save. The gray lady trapped in grief for a love forbidden or betrayed. The black lady harbinger of death, cloaked in despair and warning of calamities to come. To live in a castle was to know that your stone walls and iron gates couldn't keep them out. The lady in white was the most widespread, appearing from England's great halls to Germany's fortresses. Her stories almost always tied to motherhood. At House Castle in Bohemia, peasants whispered of a woman who drifted through the courtyard, cradling something invisible in her arms, sobbing as though her infant had been stolen. In France, one tale told of a noble woman punished for concealing her stillborn child. Condemned for sin, she was said to walk the castle stairwells every night searching for the baby she could never hold again. In life, these women were forgotten or condemned. In death, their grief became eternal, and anyone unlucky enough to cross their path was forced to bear witness. Imagine waking in the night to the sound of a lullaby, soft and broken, only to find no cradle, no mother, just a figure in white gliding past your bedchamber door. The gray lady's tales were different, less maternal, and more tangled in betrayal. She is the lover, betrayed, the wife abandoned, the mistress discarded when her beauty faded. Castles with their politics of marriage and alliances were breeding grounds for such misery. In Scotland, Glamis Castle claimed a grey lady haunting its chapel. Some said she was Lady Janet Douglas, accused of witchcraft and burned, returning to kneel eternally in prayer for the justice she never received. In Ireland, servants whispered of a grey lady who walked the battlements, weeping for the lover who had promised to return, but was executed before her eyes. Her sorrow wasn't for children lost, but for love severed, and her punishment was to replay the heartbreak each night under moonlight. You didn't need to believe in ghosts to feel it. One glance at those silent corridors, and you could almost hear her footsteps brushing the flagstones. Then there is the Black Lady, the darkest of all. She wasn't simply mourning, she was warning. She arrived in silence, her dress trailing like smoke, and her appearance often foretold disaster. At Dudley Castle in England, sightings of a Black Lady were said to precede sickness or death in the household. In Germany, at Hohen Castle, a cloaked figure in black was believed to appear before the death of a family member, a living omen no priest could banish. Unlike the white or gray lady, the Black Lady did not weep or plead. She judged, and if she stopped at your bedside, you might not wake again. People in the Middle Ages didn't dismiss these stories as campfire tales. They believed them with the same certainty they believed in saints and angels. Chroniclers recorded them. Priests preached about them. Even lords ordered mass, said for the restless women who wandered their halls. It wasn't just about superstition. It was about guilt. Castles were built on betrayal, conquest, and secrets buried in cellars. Women died in childbirth, in arranged marriages, in scandals hushed up behind stone walls. Their silence in life became their voice in death. The lady in white, gray, or black was more than a ghost. She was history itself, refusing to stay buried. Imagine the servants rising before dawn to stoke fires in the kitchens, pausing when they hear the soft sweep of fabric behind them. Turning, they'd see nothing but shadows. Yet the air felt wrong, colder, as though someone had passed, or a knight, half drunk after a feast, stumbling through corridors, only to find a woman in pale gray, standing in the moonlight, her eyes full of sorrow. He would fall to his knees, swearing repentance, and wake in the morning, unsure if it was a dream or a warning. Some stories even claimed the ladies touched the living, a hand brushing a cheek cold as snow, a whisper against the ear that no one else could hear. The bravest men admitted it left them shaken for days. And always there was the question of why they lingered. Priests explained it as purgatory, souls caught between heaven and hell, working through unfinished sins. Folk whispered of curses, of women wronged so cruelly that their spirits were chained to stone until justice was done. Some believed the castles themselves held them hostage, that walls soaked in misery could not let go of the ones who suffered most within. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. No. Noble family could sit secure in their hall without the fear that a pale figure might glide through the shadows. A reminder that death had a long memory. You lie awake now, staring into the darkness, listening to the silence between the wind's howl and the crack of timbers. There it is again, a soft sound, not footsteps exactly, but the swish of cloth across stone. Your chest tightens. The fire is out, the room colder now, and when you look toward the doorway, you see her. She's tall, her gown flowing like water, her face hidden, her form more shadow than flesh. She doesn't move toward you. She doesn't need to. The message is in her presence. Someone in this castle is about to lose more than sleep. The White Lady mourns. The Gray Lady grieves. The Black Lady warns. And tonight, you don't know which one stands in your doorway. You only know she has come for you. The storm begins the way all storms do, with a shift in the air that makes the hairs on your arms rise before the first sound has even rolled across the horizon. In a medieval castle, storms were not background noise, not a mild inconvenience to ignore while you scrolled through distractions or flipped on electric lights. They were theater and terror rolled into one. The walls shook with every thunderclap. The torches guttered in their sconces, and the shadows of the hall twisted as though something darker had forced its way inside. Rain pounded the stone so hard it sounded like fists hammering at the walls, and every crash of lightning turned the windows into flashing portals where faces seemed to leer from the night. You didn't hear weather. You heard the voice of the beyond. To people then, thunder was not just air colliding, but an army marching in the heavens, the hooves of demonic horses or the war drums of the damned. Each boom shook through the bones until your teeth ached, and no prayer was enough to drown it out. Lightning forked across the sky, jagged and white, and peasants muttered that it was the devil's claw raking at the world. From inside a castle where the ceilings were high and the echoes endless, the sound grew monstrous, the halls magnifying each strike into the roar of something alive. It wasn't hard to believe that a storm was not simply weather, but visitation. The wind played its own tricks. It moaned through arrow slits. It howled down chimneys. It whistled beneath doors, and none of it sounded natural. Servants lying awake swore they heard voices riding on the gusts. Long wails like women in grief, whispers that carried their names. even deep laughter that seemed to circle the keep. One knight claimed he heard the clatter of armored riders in the storm winds, a ghostly cavalry galloping overhead, their cries swallowed by thunder. Another told of a voice calling orders from the dark, sharp commands he could not understand, but which made him grip his sword in fear. People said storms were when the veil thinned, when the dead used wind and rain as their choir to remind the living they were still close. Faces appeared too, or so they swore. Lightning lit the sky in bursts, and in those bursts some saw things they could never forget. A farmer on watch claimed he saw the twisted face of his dead brother in the clouds, mouth open as if screaming. A cook swore she saw a pale woman framed in a flash of light, her arms outstretched toward the towers, and when the thunder came, it was like her wail carried down into the kitchens. Even the nobility were not immune. There were tales of lords who sat in their halls, counting the seconds between flash and roar, when suddenly they saw a face pressed against the high glass of a window, a face that should not have been there, pale and flickering before the darkness swallowed it again. The terror was not just in what was seen or heard, but in what was believed. Storms were messages. A violent crack of thunder directly above meant judgment. A bolt striking too close meant curses. If lightning hit the chapel roof, it was a sign of sin festering within. If wind tore banners from the battlements, it meant betrayal was near. And if in the heart of the storm you heard a voice speaking in tones not human, it meant demons had slipped through the cracks in the sky. Some castles even claimed storms brought armies of the dead to march their grounds, spectral battalions moving through courtyards in rhythm with the thunder, their pale forms illuminated only when the heavens split with fire. No one took storms lightly. Fires were lit in chapels. Bells were rung to scare away the demons. Prayers were shouted over the roar of the wind, desperate and frantic. Yet nothing silenced the storm. Servants huddled together in cellars, clutching each other as the walls shook. Nobles wrapped themselves in cloaks and tried to read by candlelight, pretending calm while the flames bent and flickered with every gust. And all the while, outside the windows, lightning painted the sky with fleeting, dreadful images. Faces in the clouds, hands reaching from the rain, figures outlined against the battlements that vanished as soon as darkness returned. Imagine lying awake in your tower chamber as the storm builds. The wind begins to moan like a dying man, threading itself through every crack in the stone. You pull the blanket over your head, but the thunder explodes directly above, rattling the walls until dust falls from the ceiling. Another flash, and you swear you see a silhouette standing in the corner of your room, frozen and waiting. You blink, and the figure is gone, but your heart doesn't slow. The next burst of light shows nothing at all, but the next clap of thunder carries a sound that chills you more than anything. Your name spoken low and long, as though the storm itself has found you. You tell yourself, it's just fear, just imagination. But medieval people had no such luxury. To them, storms were living things, battles raging in the heavens, voices of the lost crying to be heard. The dead marched in the clouds, demons clawed at the rooftops, and every roar of thunder was a reminder that stone walls could not keep out what came with the rain. You could hide You could pray, but you could not escape, because when the storm spoke, the only thing louder than its voice was the knowledge that something was listening. You shuffle through the castle corridors at night, clutching a candle whose flame trembles against the draft. When the air around you changes in an instant, one moment it is heavy and damp, thick with the smell of stone and smoke, and the next it bites against your skin like mid-winter frost. Your breath fogs in the dark, your fingers numb against the brass holder, and for a sickening moment, you wonder if you have somehow stepped outdoors without realizing it. But you are still deep inside the keep, walls thicker than your body is, wide, and the sudden chill makes no sense. In the medieval mind, there was only one explanation: spirits. Cold was the breath of the dead, a warning that they had drawn near, and once you felt it, you could not shake the thought that something unseen now stood beside you. Cold spots were as feared as they were expected. Peasants believed them to be the resting places of those who had died unschwen, their souls trapped in misery, radiating frost. No fire could soften. Nobles whispered of chambers that froze in summer, where tapestries stiffened with rime and wine casks cracked from within. Though no breeze stirred, servants hated these places most of all, for they were the ones sent to fetch supplies or lay fires in them. They spoke of feeling their breath stolen, of shivering so hard their teeth rattled, though they had been sweating only moments before. Some swore they saw their own shadows turned pale in the icy gloom, lengthening unnaturally, as if the cold itself had taken hold of the light. And yet, as frightening as the chill was, the opposite terror could also strike. Castles carried tales of rooms that grew unbearably hot without hearth or flame, chambers where the air suddenly thickened like a furnace blast. People told of entering a hall and feeling their skin prickle with heat, sweat beading instantly on their brows, even though the fire pit lay cold and untouched. Sometimes the heat was harmless, a suffocating wave that passed as suddenly as it came, but other times it ended in flame. Entire rooms were said to burst into fire, tapestries igniting without spark, wooden rafters smoldering until the chamber filled with choking smoke. The explanation, of course, was not careless servants or accidents. It was the wrath of the unseen, spirits angered by disturbance, lashed out with fire, the element of judgment. One chronicler in France recorded the tale of a storeroom that caught flame each midsummer's eve. The servants, who had grown weary of hauling water to put it out, finally refused to enter the chamber altogether. They insisted the blaze came from the ghost of a cook burned alive in that very place, condemned to kindle her own death again and again. Another castle in Germany carried the legend of a great hall where the air would grow so hot during winter feasts that guests tore off their furs drenched in sweat. They laughed at first, calling it the wine. But when several collapsed from the suffocating heat, the laughter ended. Priests were summoned, the walls sprinkled with holy water, but the warmth always returned, a presence that felt more like rage than comfort. The worst tales combined both extremes: sudden drops into icy despair, followed by bursts of unbearable heat, as though the very room were caught in battle between spirits. A squire in Scotland swore he felt his skin burn while his breath smoked. In front of him, the clash of frost and fire ripping through the chamber with no cause he could see. He ran from the room half mad, certain he had walked through the boundary of hell itself. Others described standing in chapels where the air turned cold enough to stiffen candles, only to feel the flames flare taller a moment later, snapping as though fed by unseen breath. People did not dismiss these shifts as chance. To them, temperature was not just weather, but judgment. A cold spot meant the presence of sorrow, the lingering grief of a soul who had not found peace. A burning room meant anger, the fury of someone wronged who now punished the living with heat and flame. And so the faithful turned to ritual. In icy chambers, priests muttered prayers for the dead, hoping to soothe their misery. In overheated halls, they performed blessings to calm wrath before it set the castle itself all light. But often, nothing helped. The cold crept back. The heat surged again. The castle breathed in ways stone should never breathe. Imagine standing in such a chamber yourself. You push open the heavy oak door, expecting stale air and dust, only to be hit by a blast so cold your fingers seize around the latch. You see frost bloom across the stones, crawling upward like white fingers, and you retreat, shuddering, heart racing. Another night, you enter the same room and find it stifling, your lungs refusing to fill, your skin reening as if you've been thrust too close to a forge. You drop to your knees, gasping, certain the room itself means to smother you. And then it passes, leaving nothing but silence, as though the castle has toyed with you. A reminder that its spirits dictate the rules, not you. In the medieval imagination, these changes were proof that walls remembered. Castles had soaked in centuries of death, murders, betrayals, accidents, sieges, and their stones did not forget. Cold was sorrow preserved. Heat was rage burning still. You could ignore it if you dared dismiss it as drafts or bad mortar. But when frost gathered on your blankets in July, or flames leapt from stone without cause, your skepticism faltered, because castles did not need voices or figures to prove they were haunted. Sometimes they only needed to breathe differently, reminding you that you were not alone in your own skin. And so, night after night, people slept lightly, waiting for the moment the air around them turned. A sudden chill across the chest, a wow stifling heat that made the heart pound, a reminder that in these walls even the temperature could betray you. One moment you froze, the next you burned, and in both sensations the truth was the same. The living did not control the castle, the dead did. The well stands in the center of the courtyard, its stones worn smooth by centuries of hands, its bucket rope frayed and darkened with age. To a medieval household, it is lifeblood, the source of water for drinking, cooking, and washing. But no one approaches it after nightfall. In the daylight, it is simply a well, deep and black, with a faint echo when the bucket hits the surface. At night, it becomes something else entirely. People lower their voices when they pass it, as if afraid to draw its attention, because everyone knows the well is not just a hole in the ground. It is a doorway, and what lies beneath does not always stay below. The fear begins with the water itself. Wells were supposed to refresh, but in certain castles the taste was wrong, bitter, metallic, or sour, even when freshly drawn, as though the earth itself had been poisoned. Servants swore the buckets sometimes rose, filled not with water, but with thick, dark liquid that smelled of rot, only to turn back into clear water once the torchlight hit it. Some claimed to see faces reflected in the rippling surface, pale, sunken, unblinking faces that did not move when they did. To drink from such a well was considered dangerous, for the water might not only sicken your body, but corrupt your soul. Folk whispers said demons tainted it, twisting what was meant to nourish into a curse. And then there were the voices. Countless stories tell of people leaning over to drop the bucket and hearing something other than the splash, a whisper, soft and faint, curling up the shaft like smoke. Sometimes it was laughter, high and cruel. Other times it was a child's cry echoing with such clarity that listeners swore they could almost see the tiny hands reaching from the dark. The voices weren't random. They knew things. A soldier claimed the well called his name. One night, whispering a secret only his dead brother would have known. A scullery maid fled, screaming after the water repeated her prayer back to her in a mocking tone. No one wanted to listen for long, because once the well spoke, it never stopped. Drowned children haunted these stories. Most of all, wells were dangerous places, their mouths gaping open, their edges slick. It took only one slip, one moment of inattention, for a life to be swallowed. And in castles, where courtyards bustled, with barefoot little ones darting between chores, accidents were common, but people insisted the children never left. At Warwick Castle, tales told of a pale boy's face rising just beneath the surface, lips blue, eyes wide, vanishing when the bucket disturbed the water. In Bohemia, villagers spoke of hearing small hands slap against the stones at night, a wet rhythm like desperate climbing. Mothers warned their children not to approach wells alone, not because of accidents, but because the dead might pull them in to keep them company. Some believe the wells were gateways to the underworld itself. The earth swallowed bodies, the water connected to unseen depths. And through those depths, things crawled upward. Demons were said to enter through the shafts, their voices twisting into the cries of the innocent to lure the living closer. One chronicler described a castle where the well boiled without fire, steam rising thick and foul, as though the pit beneath had connected to hell itself. Another spoke of a nobleman who peered down one evening and swore he saw not water, but flames flickering far below, the cries of the damned riding upward with the heat. He sealed the well the next morning, but the voices still carried through the stones at night, echoing under his floors. Folklore wrapped around these fears like ivy. People told of cursed buckets that pulled themselves downward, ropes snapping as though yanked by invisible hands. They warned of wells that reflected not your face, but the face of someone you loved, their lips forming words you could not hear. They spoke of water that turned red after a battle, as if the blood spilled in the courtyard seeped straight through the ground. Servants swore that throwing a coin or a charm into a haunted well meant losing it forever to whatever lived below. A gift that bought no luck, only attention. And attention was the last thing anyone wanted. Still, necessity forced people back. Water had to be drawn, no matter the hour, no matter the dread. A girl might creep to the well at dawn, muttering prayers as she lowered the bucket, trembling at every creak of the rope. A soldier might fetch a drink and spit it out, claiming the water burned like fire in his throat. Yet no one ever dared fill the well in or abandon it. To close it off was to anger what lived inside, and no one wanted to find out what might happen if the voices were silenced. The well was not just part of the castle, it was part of its soul, a dark heart that beat underground. Picture yourself there, lantern in hand, staring into the circle of black. The light doesn't reach far, swallowed almost immediately by the depths. You hear the drip of water, steady and hollow, and lean closer, straining to see. Then it comes a whisper so faint, you almost convince yourself it's the wind. But it shapes your name curling through the air like smoke. You stumble back, clutching the lantern, but your curiosity drags your eyes to the surface. For a moment, you see it, a pale face just beneath the ripples, lips parting as though about to speak. The lantern flickers, the face vanishes, and the well is only a well again, except you can't shake the feeling that it saw you, that it knows you, and that sooner or later it will call again. Because in castles, wells were never only for water. They were mouths to the underworld, patient and hungry, waiting for the next soul, careless enough to lean too close. The first time you see it, you tell yourself it's just rain. The castle walls are darkened from the storm, water sleeing down in rivulets that shimmer under the lightning, pooling at the base of the courtyard. But then you notice the color, not clear, not clean. A rusty red trickles between the stones, staining the moss and dripping onto the cobbles in slow, deliberate drops. The air smells sharper now, metallic, like iron left too long in the sun. And in that moment, you realize what the medieval world already believed. The castle itself is bleeding. Such stories were whispered across Europe, told in fire-lit halls by servants who swore they'd seen the stones cry. A massacre in the Great Hall, a betrayal in the chapel, a rebellion drowned in its own blood. These were not events to be contained in memory. The earth drank them, the stones soaked them, and sometimes the wounds reopened centuries later. Chroniclers recorded walls that seeped red during storms, as though rain woke what had been buried. The color ran down corridors, spattered across windowsills, and stained the hands of anyone foolish enough to touch it. Lords tried to explain it as mineral deposits, rust, or tricks of light, but no explanation calmed the servants who refused to pass those places after dark, muttering that the dead still bled through the mortar. One tale came from a fortress in Ireland, where a lord had slaughtered his own men after suspecting them of treachery. Their bodies were burned, their ashes scattered in the courtyard. But the next storm brought streams of crimson dripping from the tower walls. No amount of scrubbing erased it. Priests performed blessings, sprinkling holy water along the battlements, yet the stains returned with every rainfall. Locals claimed the blood would not stop until the Lord himself was buried within the walls he had defiled. And when he finally died, the seepage ceased. Another castle in Germany carried the legend of a feast-turned-massacre where guests were butchered at the table. For generations, during heavy storms, the walls of the Great Hall were said to ooze dark streaks and the rain outside smelled faintly of rot. The phenomenon wasn't always tied to storms. Some castles were said to bleed on anniversaries of violence, the exact day and hour when betrayal had occurred at a stronghold in France. Villagers claimed that every midsummer night, the stones of the chapel floor darkened as though soaked in fresh gore, no matter how dry the season. Soldiers stationed there refused to enter, saying they heard the slap of wet footsteps echoing behind them. In Bohemia, one keep became notorious for its weeping walls. Prisoners executed in its dungeons left behind stains that reappeared no matter how many times the stone was scraped clean. The blood seeped back, pale at first, then darkening over hours until it seemed to drip. The jailers stopped, trying to scrub it. Instead, they left bowls of salt by the walls, in the hope it would draw out the corruption. It never worked. People interpreted these bleedings as confessions. Castles could not speak, but they remembered. Their walls bore witness to everything that happened inside them. The cruelty, the betrayals, the killings no chronicle dared record. And when the weight of silence grew too heavy, the stones themselves wept to medieval minds. This was justice. Blood demanded recognition. It would not stay hidden in the soil. It would rise, trickle, and remind the living of the price paid. Some called it divine punishment, others the vengeance of restless spirits, but all agreed it meant the castle was alive, its memory etched not in words, but in crimson stains. Imagine living there. Rain begins to fall, and everyone stiffens. Servants cross themselves before daring to fetch water from the courtyard, avoiding their gaze as they pass the weeping walls. You stand beneath an arch and watch as red streaks form, winding down like veins pulsing across the stone. The water is sticky to the touch, darker than any rust, and when you bring your fingers to your nose, the metallic tang makes your stomach churn. Later, when the storm passes, the stains remain, dried into the cracks, as though the stones themselves have been wounded. You tell yourself it's natural, but when the torches flicker against the streaks, they gleam wet again, and you swear the wall size. Priests were often summoned, for no one could live comfortably in a castle that bled. They carried relics, chanted psalms, sprinkled holy water until the floors were slick, and proclaimed the hauntings banished. Yet the next storm returned the stains as faithful as the sunrise. Some lords tried to ignore it, laughing it off as tales for children. But laughter rang hollow when guests recoiled from the sight of crimson dripping down the chapel wall. To deny what was in front of you was impossible, and denial only deepened the fear. Worse still were the nights when the walls bled without rain, when servants woke to the sound of dripping in the corridors, carried torches to investigate, and found red trails winding from ceilings to floors with no source but stone itself. These nights sparked whispers of curses, of masons buried alive in the foundations, of innocents sacrificed to sanctify the walls, of betrayed men crying out for vengeance. If blood could seep from the stones, then the castle itself was guilty, and everyone living within its embrace shared the burden. You cannot sleep easy in a place like that. You lie awake, listening to the storm outside, wondering if the next flash of lightning will reveal streaks crawling across your chamber wall. You avoid touching the stones, afraid of what might stain your hand. You shiver when you hear the faint patter of water in the hall, knowing it may not be water at all, and always in your mind is the same question: whose blood is it? Whose death is still fresh enough, angry enough to force its way through stone? In the end, you realize the truth that every medieval dweller knew. Castles are not only made of mortar and rock, they are made of memory. They carry every act committed within them, every betrayal sealed in their shadows. And sometimes, when those memories grow too heavy, the walls themselves must speak. They do not whisper, they do not sigh, they bleed. The plague came like a shadow that swallowed everything in its path, and castles, for all their walls and guards, could not keep it out. The Black Death seeped through gates as easily as wind, and once inside, it left silence in its wake. But silence in a castle was never true. Silence. Those who survived whispered that long after the sick had been buried or left unburied, their presence lingered, and in the years when pestilence swept across Europe, haunted castles filled with omens of death that no one dared ignore. At first it was the bells. They tolled at every passing, a mournful dirge for the dozens carried daily from chambers to grave pits. But when the living were too weak to pull the ropes, the bells rang anyway. Servants swore they heard them toll at midnight, single heavy notes rolling across the courtyard. Though no one stood in the belfry, the sound carried into every hall, shaking tapestries, rattling goblets, and turning breath to frost. For those who lay in their sick beds, hearing the ghostly bells was the final warning. You didn't need a priest to tell you the meaning. Your name had already been called. Then there were the carts. Every castle knew them, wooden wheels groaning as they carried bodies stacked like firewood. The stench clung to the stones for months, an invisible film that even smoke and lime could not erase. But long after the carts had ceased to roll, their echoes returned. Guards on night watch reported hearing wheels grind across the cobblestones, horses snorting, the creak of wood burdened with its grim load. Yet when they peered into the courtyard, it was empty or nearly empty. Some swore they glimpsed the outline of wagons in the moonlight, transparent and gray, with pale figures swaying atop the piles. The drivers were shadows themselves, hoods pulled low, never speaking, only driving their endless route between the dead and the ground that waited for them. Inside the chambers, sickness left marks that stone refused to forget. The smell of rot, without cause, curling out of corners, making healthy men gag. Beds were stripped and burned, yet those who entered swore they saw the depressions of bodies still lying there, invisible forms shifting against the linens. Nurses, hardened by suffering, claimed to hear coughing from empty rooms, dry hacks that rattled through the air, always followed by silence too heavy to breathe. Some fled their posts, unwilling to spend nights in the company of the unseen sick. Those who stayed began to mutter prayers, even when no one was dying, hoping to keep away the spirits of the contagion. The plague was more than a disease. It was a terror people thought alive, a demon stalking castles and villages alike. When omens appeared, no one dismissed them. A black dog prowling the yard meant death within days. A pale figure at the gates meant the sickness had returned. Whole households went rigid when shadows gathered along the rafters, as though invisible mourners had assembled to watch. There were accounts of cloaked shapes moving through the castle chapel, ringing invisible bells with every step, their presence too heavy to be mistaken for dream. People said these were not simply ghosts of the dead, but personifications of the plague itself, mocking the prayers and rituals that had failed to keep it out. One story from England told of a castle whose walls dripped with moisture during the height of the pestilence. Servants swore it wasn't water, but sweat, the very breath of the dying seeping through the stones. Another in Italy told of whispers that filled the corridors, low chanting in languages no one recognized, rising louder at night until the sick gave up fighting and the healthy fled. Chroniclers desperate to explain described these hauntings as omens sent by God, reminders of sin that had brought pestilence upon the world. But to those who lived in the shadow of the Black Death, they were simply neighbors. Death carts that rolled unseen, bells that told themselves, rooms that stank of rot, though no bodies lay within. Imagine being one of the few left alive in a half-empty castle. The fires burn low because no one has strength to feed them. The courtyard is silent except for rain dripping from the battlements. You walk past the gate and stop cold because there it is, the faint creak of wheels, the slap of hooves on wet stone. You force yourself to look, heart hammering, and in the midst you see the faint outline of a cart, piled high with forms wrapped in shrouds. You know every person in the castle who has died. You can count their names, but the card is not empty. It carries more than the dead. It carries you. No walls could keep out the plague, and no prayers could banish its specters. Even after the waves of death passed, the omens returned. With every storm, every winter, every cough in the dark, ghostly bells rang to remind survivors of how thin the line was between life and death. Carts creaked across empty courtyards to warn that the ground was never finished claiming bodies and the air of castles. Those great stone fortresses that promised safety was never free of the scent of sickness. It lingered, stubborn as memory, heavy as grief. Because in the age of plague, castles didn't just house the living, they became mausoleums, and their ghosts never left. The bells still toll, the carts still roll, and the plague, though centuries gone, still waits at the gates. The chapel was supposed to be the safest place in the castle, a sanctuary of stone and candlelight, its walls thick with prayers whispered over centuries, its altar kissed by relics meant to shield the living from whatever darkness prowled outside. Yet for many, it was not safety they felt when they entered after sundown, but unease. The air grew too still, the silence too loud, as though someone or something waited among the pews. A place meant to banish fear often became its epicenter. For what could be more terrifying than discovering the holy had been invaded? People spoke of haunted altars, sanctuaries that refused to protect those who knelt before them. In some castles, the carved stone of the altar was said to seep with stains that no scrubbing could erase. Dark blotches, shaped like hands, pressed hard into the rock. Others swore the chalices rattled on their own, tipping and spilling wine that looked too much like blood. At one keep in Germany, a priest reported that during midnight mass, the candles blew out in unison, though no wind stirred, and when they flared back to life, the crucifix above the altar was turned upside down. He refused to serve again in that chapel, claiming it belonged no longer to God, but to something that mocked him. Degraded relics filled these stories too, objects once believed to carry divine protection, now tainted with dread. A bone of a saint that rattled inside its reliquary without being touched. A fragment of the true cross that grew so hot during prayer it burned the hands of the monk holding it in one fortress. The silver reliquary itself cracked open with a sound like thunder, though no living hand had dared touch it. The treasures, meant to protect the faithful, seemed instead to betray them, as if their power had been inverted by some unseen hand. Servants whispered, the demons delighted in corrupting what was most sacred, not destroying it outright, but twisting it into a parody of itself. And then there were the phantom monks. Castles with chapels often claimed to host processions long after the resident clergy had died. At first, people thought they were dreams, the sound of footsteps padding across the flagstones, the low murmur of chants rising in rhythm. But the details grew too vivid. Guards posted outside chapels swore they heard entire choirs singing in the night, Latin verses rolling like waves. Yet when they flung open the doors, the chapel stood empty, its silence crushing. Others saw them directly, cowled figures drifting between pews, their heads bowed, their lips moving in words no one could understand. Some claimed the monks were not holy at all, but disguises, demons cloaked in piety, echoing sacred rites in tones twisted just enough to curdle the air. The tension between sacred and profane pulsed in every account. The chapel was supposed to be a shield, but it became instead a reminder that no place was beyond reach. People feared the dungeons for their cruelty and the halls for their echoes, but it was the chapel that kept them awake at night, because here the war was not between men, but between heaven and hell. When the altar wept blood, when the crucifix turned, when the monks chanted in empty air, the message was clear. The sacred had been breached. If the castle's holiest room could not stand against the darkness, what hope did the rest have? One story from France told of a knight who sought sanctuary in a chapel after murdering his lord. He clung to the altar, begging for protection, when suddenly the relics burst into flame. Witnesses swore they saw a black shape rise from behind the altar, smoke curling around its limbs, its eyes glowing like embers. The knight screamed once and fell dead, his body untouched by fire, though his lips were seared black. To the household, it was proof that the chapel itself had turned executioner, corrupted into an instrument of judgment. Another tale from Spain spoke of a castle where the monks had been massacred during a siege. Afterward, phantom processions wound through the chapel every night, but their chants grew harsher with each ear, until listeners swore they were curses, not prayers. Imagine sitting in the chapel at night, torchlight casting long shadows across the walls. The silence is heavy, yet you hear it. The faint scrape of sandals, the low hum of voices. You hold your breath, praying it's your imagination, but the sound swells, filling the chamber, and shapes emerge from the corners. Monks in hooded robes, their faces hidden, their forms insubstantial. They march past you, ignoring your presence, their lips moving in words that make your skin crawl. Then one stops, lifting his head. Beneath the hood, you glimpse not a face, but a hollow void, darker than the rest of the night. You look away, but when you glance back, the procession is gone. Only the silence remains. Heavier now, pressing on your chest like a hand. Priests tried to fight such hauntings with blessings and relics, but their efforts often backfired. The more they prayed, the more the disturbances grew. Some chapels were abandoned altogether, their doors locked, their altars left to gather dust. People preferred to build new shrines in the open air rather than enter a room where the sacred had been mocked. For in the medieval mind, nothing was more terrifying than a holy place turned hostile. A demon in the dungeon was dreadful. Yes, but a demon in the chapel was catastrophic. It meant that even the weapons of faith had failed. And so, the stories endured, retold in whispers over meager suppers, passed on by servants who refused to clean the chapels alone, by guards who crossed themselves when they heard phantom bells ring during the night. A castle could survive sieges, fires, and famine, but once the chapel was tainted, the fortress was never the same. The walls themselves seemed to know it, groaning in storms, trembling with echoes of chants long gone, because once the demon entered the chapel, it was no longer just a ghost story. It was a warning that even the holiest of spaces could be claimed, and once claimed, they were never truly returned. It begins with a whisper, as all curses do. A servant caught muttering to herself while gathering herbs in the courtyard. A woman glimpsed in the shadows, her lips moving silently as the Lord rides past. A quarrel that ends with words too sharp, too ominous to be forgotten. In a world where misfortune had 100 faces, failed harvests, dying cattle, stillborn children, it was easy to blame the unseen hand of witchcraft, and nowhere did that fear grow more potent than inside the thick walls of a castle, where power concentrated like storm clouds, and enemies lurked both outside and within. Castles were not only fortresses, they were crucibles of paranoia. Every sickness that struck the Lord's children, every crack in the walls after a storm, every accident in the stables, each could be the result of a curse. Lords ruled by divine right, so any misfortune felt like an attack not only on their flesh but on heaven's favor itself. And so suspicion turned inward. Women who knew too much about plants, too much about childbirth, too much about survival were suddenly threats, accused of whispering dark prayers, of consorting with spirits, of slipping powders into cups. They were dragged before judges in the great hall, their names blackened, their fates sealed. The castle itself became the stage where these trials played out, where whispers turned to screams and screams to silence, but silence never truly lasted, for many believe the accused returned, vengeful and unrepentant. A woman burned in the courtyard was said to reappear on stormy nights, her figure glowing faintly in the rain, her mouth moving in curses no fire could consume. A healer, drowned in the castle moat for practicing charms, was heard afterward in the rush of water, her voice a constant chant, that rose and fell with the current. A midwife, accused of killing a noble infant, appeared in corridors years after her death, rocking an invisible child in her arms, her eyes burning with grief and fury. These spirits were not gentle. They lingered not as victims, but as punishers, turning every creak in the hall into a reminder of injustice, every flicker of shadow into a threat. Some castles gained reputations as cursed fortresses, their stones steeped in suspicion. One in Bavaria was said to have fallen under a witch's curse after a lord executed her without trial. From that day, lightning struck the towers with every summer storm, and no heir survived past the age of 30. Chroniclers noted the coincidences with nervous precision, unwilling to deny the pattern. In Scotland, a noblewoman accused of sorcery swore with her final breath that no child of her accuser would ever inherit in peace. True enough, each generation saw heirs die young, some in battle, some in bed, until the line itself withered. Whether or not she had wielded power in life, her curse seemed to own the future. The terror spread downward, seeping into servants' quarters. They lived with the Lord's suspicions, but bore the brunt of the hauntings. A maid, sweeping the great hall late at night, might feel a sudden cold hand brush hers, though no one stood beside her. A cook swore she saw a woman in tattered skirts leaning over the cauldron, scattering herbs into the stew, only for the figure to vanish when she cried out. Guards posted at the gate heard muttered prayers carried on the wind, the same words repeated night after night until one refused to stand watch again. The very air seemed thick with paranoia, as if the curse clung to every stone. And of course there were the trials themselves, rituals of fear dressed up as justice. Women were dragged before the court, their hands bound, their voices ignored as accusations piled like stones on their backs. Some were pry-pricked with needles to find the witch's mark, others forced into water tests where sinking meant innocence and floating meant guilt. No outcome saved them. They died in fire, in rope, in drowning pits, and their deaths were supposed to cleanse the castle of corruption. Yet all it did was deepen the fear, because once the flames died, the shadows remained. The women who had been silenced returned louder than ever, haunting the lords who condemned them, cursing their bloodlines, staining the stones with unrest. Imagine living in such a place, where every misfortune carried a face. The crops fail, and whispers spread that a servant has hexed the fields. A knight falls from his horse, and eyes turn toward the widow, who muttered a prayer at his departure. The baby coughs in the nursery, and suddenly, every woman who has touched the cradle is a suspect. Fear twists into certainty, and certainty into violence, until the screams echo in the great hall, and the smell of smoke lingers in the courtyard. But when the punishment is over, when the ashes have cooled, no one feels safer. The curse is never gone. It has only been fed, and the truth of it settles in the bones of the castle itself. These were places where betrayal was common, where justice bent to power, where superstition ruled decisions that shaped lives. Every castle had its ghosts, but the most feared were not nameless soldiers or faceless servants. They were women whose names had been spoken, whose voices had been silenced, whose deaths had been unjust. They were accused of witchcraft, condemned by fear and returned with fire in their eyes. Their curses seeped into the walls, into the rafters, into the very ground. You sit by the fire now, listening to the crackle of the wood, and for a moment the flames spit sparks too high, too fierce. The shadows twist unnaturally across the stone, and you swear you hear a whisper curling between the beams. It is not the wind. It is a voice, low and sharp, murmuring words you don't understand, but feel in your blood. You glance at the others, gathered, and their faces are pale, their eyes wide. They hear it too. The curse is alive, and it is not finished. The banquet hall is the beating heart of the castle, a place meant for life. Roaring laughter, dripping meat, goblets raised high, the air thick with the smell of roast and spilled ale. But when night presses in and the fires gutter low, the same hall can turn into something else entirely. Imagine a lord walking the corridors after midnight, restless, perhaps drawn by the echo of music drifting faintly through the air. He pushes open the great oak doors, expecting silence and shadows. Instead, the hall blazes with candlelight. Tables are laden with meats, glistening in fat, fruits piled high, bread steaming as though fresh from the oven. Goblets brim with dark wine, and every seat is filled with figures he half recognizes, friends long buried, rivals slain in duels, ancestors whose portraits watch from the walls. All of them laughing, eating, drinking, all of them dead. The phenomenon was whispered about across Europe. Ghostly banquets that appeared in castles where blood had been spilled, feasts that no living host had prepared. Lords claimed they were summoned to these gatherings as unwilling guests, seated among pale diners whose eyes glowed faintly in the firelight. To eat was dangerous, for the food turned to ash on the tongue or rotted in the mouth. Yet not eating was worse, for the dead pressed their goblets into unwilling hands, their voices booming in songs that were never sung by the living. Some chroniclers recorded noblemen who returned from such feasts hollow-eyed, whispering that they had dined with their grandfathers, that they had seen brothers slain in battle raise their cups in greeting. Others never returned at all, their bodies found cold in the morning, faces twisted as though they had choked on invisible food. The music was the first sign, servant said, a faint string note curling through the corridors, a drumbeat thewing like a heartbeat. Voices lifted in songs no one knew, but everyone felt. At times it was joyous, at others mournful, but always it lured. Guards at their posts swore they heard it and turned their heads only to glimpse shadows flickering as if dancers spun within. When the doors opened, the feast erupted, a spectacle of lights and laughter that no candle or torch could replicate. Yet all of it was wrong. The laughter carried too long, bending into wails. The music lacked breath, as though the instruments played themselves. And the diners, though they moved, though they raised their goblets, seemed hollow, as if their joy were a mask stretched over sorrow. One legend from Hungary told of a young lord who entered such a banquet and saw his entire lineage seated at the table, stretching back centuries. They greeted him warmly, beckoning him to sit. He did, raising a goblet in trembling hands. When he drank, The wine burned like fire down his throat, and his ancestors roared with laughter. He was found the next morning, dead upon the hall floor, a goblet still in his grasp, his lips stained red, though no wine had been poured in the castle for days. In Germany, another tale spoke of a servant who stumbled upon the feast while fetching logs. He claimed he saw knights with gaping wounds raising forks to their mouths, ladies whose faces were half rotted, smiling as though at a jest, and a skeleton at the head of the table carving meat from a boar that bled endlessly. He ran and never returned, his mind unraveling until he died, raving of empty tables and endless music. The strangest part was the dawn, for no matter how grand the feast, how loud the revelry, when the first light of day crept through the windows, the hall was bare again. The tables vanished, the goblets empty, the food nothing but dust. The only trace was the smell, faint rot, sour wine, and smoke from fires no one had lit. Servants hated entering the hall in the morning, whispering that the dead resented being interrupted, that one day the feast would not vanish but remain, and those who found it would be seated forever among its diners. People wondered what these banquets meant. Some believed they were omens of famine, the dead mocking the living with abundance they could never taste. Others saw them as punishment, a reminder of the excess and greed of lords who feasted while peasants starved. Priests tried to explain them as purgatorial visions, the damned replaying earthly pleasures that could never satisfy. But to those who experienced them, explanations didn't matter. What mattered was the weight of those eyes across the table, the pressure of pale fingers curling around your wrist. As a goblet is pressed into your hand, the dead demanded company, and sooner or later, they would have it. Now picture yourself stepping into that hall, drawn by music you cannot resist. The torches flare, the tables are set, and laughter rolls like thunder. At the far end, figure raises his goblet to you, smiling with a mouth too pale, eyes too bright. It is someone you know should not be there, someone gone for years. Yet he beckons, and the others turn, chairs scraping as they make space. You feel your legs move without your consent, carrying you forward. The scent of roast meat and sour wine thicken your nose. You sit. A goblet is thrust into your hand, its rim wet, its contents black. Around you, the feast rages on, the clinking of silver, the hollow laughter, the endless song. You raise the goblet to your lips, and when the sun rises, the hall will be empty again, but the dead will still be waiting for their next guest. Beneath the castle, deeper than the cellars, lower than the dungeons, lies the crypt. It is not a place for strangers or servants, but for blood, for the family whose name is carved into every stone above. You descend the steps slowly, the air cooling with each turn, the torch sputtering as though reluctant to enter. The walls narrow, pressing in, until the passage opens into a chamber lined with aloves. Within each rests a shape, a coffin, a sarcophagus, sometimes nothing more than bones arranged with care. These are the ancestors, the keepers of the lineage, the silent audience to every triumph and betrayal that unfolded in the halls above. But silence does not mean peace. Castles did not just shelter the living, they sheltered the dead, and the dead never liked to be forgotten. Crypts were supposed to inspire reverence, but more often they bred fear. Nobles knew their bloodlines depended on the blessing of those who lay beneath them, and any disturbance risked stirring something best left still. During wars, when invaders smashed open tombs or stole relics, the damage lingered long after the armies marched on. Soldiers who plundered crypts were said to die screaming in their tents, their throats blackened, their eyes wide with terror. Lords whose ancestors were dishonored found their households plagued with misfortune, as if the bones below resented the neglect. To live above a crypt was to live above a wound, and sometimes wounds reopened. The hauntings took many forms. Some were subtle, a coldness rising through the floorboards at night, a whisper curling up the stairwell, the faint shuffle of feet pacing in the chambers below. Others were impossible to ignore. Coffins were found, cracked open, bones scattered, though no hands had touched them. Guests in noble chambers awoke to see pale figures at the foot of their beds, faces hollow, crowns of shadow pressing against their brows. Servants swore they heard knocking from beneath the chapel floor during masses, slow and deliberate, as though the ancestors were protesting the prayers. And sometimes the dead rose fully, not as pale shadows, but as full figures, armored and stern, glaring at their descendants with eyes that accused. One story from Italy told of a lord who desecrated his family crypt to build a wine cellar. He ordered the bones shoved aside, the coffins stacked in corners, the loves filled with casks. But during every feast he held afterward, the wine soured in its cups, turning black and foul. Guests spat it out, cursing his name. Soon the crypt beneath rang with laughter in the night, deep and mocking, and the Lord's own son died, choking on blood, though no wound marked him. The wine was abandoned, the cellar sealed, but the laughter never stopped. Another tale from England described a castle whose crypt was looted during a raid. The bones of lords and ladies were tossed into the moat, left to sink in mud. Afterward, the castle was plagued by processions of armored phantoms stomping through the halls at midnight, their forms dripping with sludge, their mouths opening in soundless rage. The terror was sharper because the ghosts were not strangers. They were kin. To see your great-grandfather standing in the corridor, face pale, armor dented as it had been in death, was to know your blood itself was restless. Descendants felt the judgment in their bones, guilt gnawing at them for slights they never committed, but inherited nonetheless. And the crypts reminded them daily. Every prayer whispered in the chapel echoed downward. Every birth, every betrayal, every marriage, all of it carried into the silence below, where the dead listened. When their patience wore thin, they rose. Imagine being a child in such a castle, warned never to play near the crypt stairs. You sneak down anyway, daring yourself to descend just one more step. The air grows colder, the silence deeper. You strain to hear, and at first it's only your heartbeat, quick and nervous. Then faintly, another sound, a sigh, not loud, but long, carrying the weight of centuries. You bolt back up, stumbling, and the adults scold you, their faces pale, not because of your disobedience, but because they know what you heard. Children were not supposed to wake the crypt. The fear of the disturbed dead was so strong that families went to great lengths to keep their crypts sealed and sacred. Priests were brought to bless the chambers. Holy water sprinkled until the stones gleamed wet. Offerings were left at the foot of coffins, bread, wine, even coins, bribes for peace. Yet the hauntings never fully ceased, because bones, once moved, never forgot, and ancestors once awakened, never forgave. The castle walls might shield the living from raiders, but no wall could protect them from their own blood rising to demand recognition. Picture yourself lying awake in your chamber above the crypt. The night is quiet. The fire burned low, when suddenly the floor beneath you vibrates faintly, as though someone is pacing below. The rhythm is slow, measured, like armored boots crossing stone. You tell yourself it is imagination, the settling of the castle. Then comes the second sound, a knock, deliberate, against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. You freeze, every muscle tight. The knocking stops, but the air grows heavier, the smell of damp earth and old bones curling up into your nostrils. And then you hear it, the faint rasp of breath. Not yours, not anyone's alive. You roll over and find him there, a figure at the foot of your bed, tall and gaunt, wearing the crest of your own family on his breastplate. His face is a ruin of age and death, but his eyes burn with fury. He points to the floor, to the crypt below, demanding something you cannot give. Then he vanishes, leaving only the cold and the certainty that he will return. Because in a castle, the family crypt is never silent. It listens, it remembers, and when it stirs, it demands that the living answer for the dead. Some castles die once and for all. Siege engines batter their walls. Fire devours their timbers. Time reduces them to ruins where ivy coils through the stones. But there are others that refuse to stay dead, fortresses that rise again and again, rebuilt on the same cursed ground, no matter how many times they fall. Their stones carry scars that mortar cannot hide. Their halls echo with footsteps no repairs can silence. To live inside such a place is to live inside a body that will not rest, a body that bleeds, heals, and bleeds again. Dragging its ghosts forward with every reconstruction, the castle breathes, and it remembers. Across Europe, the chronicles tell of strongholds that burned to ash, only to rise anew, rebuilt, as if to mock the destruction. Yet the fires never truly left. Servants in these places whispered of smelling smoke when no hearth was lit, of waking in the night, choking on air, thick with phantom ash. One castle in Bohemia had been rebuilt 3 times, after lightning strikes set its roofs ablaze. Each time, new timber beams were cut, new stones laid, yet the courtyards filled with the same smell of char during storms, and faint embers glowed along the battlements. Though no fire touched them, visitors swore they saw figures running through the courtyards, ablaze, but silent, vanishing before they reached the gate. Other castles were gutted by siege and slaughter, their stones soaked with blood, their halls filled with screams. Yet when the rubble was cleared and masons rebuilt, the dead never left. At one fortress in France, peasants spoke of walls that seemed to sigh during the night, as if remembering their collapse. During banquets, noblemen reported hearing the clash of swords in empty corridors, spectral armies forever replaying the battle that had once brought the fortress down. Guests would pause with goblets halfway to their lips as the phantom noise rolled around them, and no one dared to ask the obvious question: why rebuild a house already owned by the dead? The truth was simple. Castles were power. To abandon one was to surrender, to let enemies claim victory, to admit defeat. So they rose again from rubble, repaired and repopulated, filled once more with laughter, music, and ambition. But the laughter was strained, for everyone inside felt the weight of what had happened there. Stones cracked in odd patterns, walls bowed slightly, staircases curved unnaturally where fire or blade had once torn them apart. No mason's skill could erase those imperfections, and to walk through the halls was to trace the scars of history under your own hand. The castle refused to die, but it carried the memory of every wound, and wounds draw ghosts. One tale from Scotland told of a castle burned by raiders, its inhabitants slaughtered as they fled. The survivors rebuilt, but from that day forward, fire never left. At night, flames licked across the ceilings without burning. Shadows danced in rooms long after torches were extinguished, and screams echoed through the courtyards whenever the wind rose. The castle functioned, lords dined, children played, servants worked, but every soul inside knew they lived alongside those still burning. Another from Germany spoke of a fortress toppled during a war, rebuilt stone by stone. But when masons laid the final wall, a black stain spread across it, seeping outward like blood. No lime or plaster could hide it. The stain remained, growing darker with each year, as though the wall itself insisted on remembering the slaughter. The strangest part of such castles was how alive they felt. Floors shuddered as if breathing. Doors swelled and groaned like joints aching in old age. A man walking down a corridor might feel the wall warm beneath his hand, pulsing faintly as if blood still moved through the stone. Others reported the opposite, a sudden cold that made their bones ache, like stepping into the chill of a corpse. It was said these castles had souls of their own, forged not in their creation, but in their destruction. Each death gave them a voice. Each rebuilding gave that voice more power. To enter them was to step not only into history, but into something still suffering. Imagine living in one. You sit at dinner, the hall bright with fire, when suddenly the lights flicker and the smell of smoke thickens. You glance up, heart racing, but the beams above are solid, the fire pit tame. Still, the air burns your lungs as though the castle is remembering its past blaze, and you find yourself coughing into your cup while others stare nervously at the rafters. Or you wake in the night to the sound of collapse, stones thundering down, screams filling the air. You bolt upright, heart pounding, only to find the walls whole and the night silent again. Yet the memory of ruin hangs heavy, as though the castle itself dreams and forces you to share in the nightmare. Priests were often called to cleanse these places, to sprinkle holy water across every scarred stone, to chant until their voices cracked. But what prayer could erase centuries of violence? What blessing could quiet walls that had collapsed a dozen times over? that had soaked up generations of screams. The castles listened politely to the rituals, then went on sighing, groaning, and replaying their memories. They refused to die, but they also refused to heal. And so those who lived in them carried on, pretending the hauntings were quirks of old stone. Servants laughed nervously when the air turned thick with ash. Nobles raised goblets over phantom music. Children played despite the cold spots that chilled their games. Life continued inside walls that had already known death too many times. But beneath it all was a truth everyone felt, even if they never said it aloud. The castle was alive, and it would never let its inhabitants forget how many times it had been destroyed, because some places cannot die. They simply remember the fire in your chamber has burned down to little more than a dull red glow, its warmth fading as the stone walls drink it greedily away. You lie beneath a scratchy blanket, staring into the dark, telling yourself you're safe because the door is bolted and the shutters latched. But the castle doesn't care about your locks. It cakes and groans like something alive, and every sound makes you tense. There's the faint scuff of movement in the corridor, too slow and measured to be a rat. A whisper rises against the wind, curling through the cracks in the shutter like smoke. The temperature drops without warning, and your breath fogs in the dark. You know what that means. The dead have come closer. The bed beneath you is no comfort. The straw shifts and scratches. But it's not the fleas that keep you awake. It's the sense that you're not the only one lying here. Every time you close your eyes, you feel the weight of another presence settling at the foot of the mattress, invisible but undeniable, the air pressing heavy against your chest. You open your eyes to emptiness, but the feeling never leaves. The castle remembers every soul that has lain in this bed before you. The knight who coughed his lungs out in a plague, the servant girl who never woke after childbirth, the lord stabbed in his sleep. Their deaths seeped into the mattress, into the stone, and now they shift restlessly, jostling you as if annoyed you've taken their space. The sounds grow clearer, chains dragging along the floor, somewhere below, each clink a reminder of prisoners who never left the dungeons. A low moan from the stairwell, rising and falling like the wind, but with a human rhythm, too close to be weather. You try to bury yourself under the blanket, as if thin cloth can shield you from centuries of grief and rage. But the castle is patient. It waits for you to close your eyes again, then breathes against your ear, cold and damp, like lips pressing from another world. Every story you've heard about this place unravels itself now, replaying in your head whether you want it to or not. The ghostly banquets where lords raised goblets with their long, dead-ad ancestors. The women in white, gray, and black drifting through the halls, their eyes hollow with betrayal and mourning. The wells that whispered children's cries, the chapels where relics cracked and demons laughed. Every chamber you pass during daylight now feels alive in the dark, their memories rising from the stone like steam. The ghosts are not scattered figures here and there. They are everywhere, crowding close, pressing at the walls, filling the silence with their unfinished stories. You are not simply a guest in the castle. You are an intruder in their restless domain. You clutch the blanket tighter, your pulse thundering in your ears and wonder how anyone survived sleeping here night after night. But that was the reality of the medieval world. Castles weren't just built to keep enemies out, they were mausoleums, prisons, chapels, feasting halls, and execution grounds, all stacked on top of one another. They weren't monuments of stone and mortar, they were memory palaces of fear, places where every life that began and ended within their walls left a trace. The living could never truly rule them. They belonged to the dead. The whisper returns, this time from the corner of the chamber. You tell yourself it's just air moving through cracks, but then it shapes itself into something almost like a word, too low to catch, but too deliberate to ignore. The hairs on your neck rise, and your eyes sting, as if smoke has crept into the room. You don't move. You barely breathe. The presence thickens until the air feels like water pressing against you from every side. And just when you think you can't bear it, a rooster crows outside the walls. The first light of dawn bleeds faintly through the shutter, and with it, the weight lifts. The whispers fade. The moan ceases. The presence recedes. The castle sigh like something disappointed, withdrawing into its scars until night comes again. You've survived, but you don't feel victorious. You feel drained, hollowed, as if part of you stayed behind in the dark with them. You rise, shaky and exhausted, and know the truth with sudden clarity. Castles were never the gleaming fairy tale, palaces the stories promised. They were cold, brutal, haunted repositories of everything humanity feared most: disease, war, betrayal, death. To sleep in one was to share a bed, not with comfort, but with centuries of misery that refused to rest. You cannot imagine anyone choosing this existence willingly, and so you drag yourself back to the modern world with a strange, fierce gratitude, because tonight, when you climb into your own bed, you won't feel invisible hands pressing against your chest. You won't hear phantom banquets raging in the hall below. You won't share your room with plague ghosts or cursed ancestors. You'll have Wi-Fi, central heating, maybe even clean sheets. You'll close your eyes, and the only thing haunting you will be your phone buzzing with notifications. And that, compared to the haunted keep, is a mercy.